good experience with Almond yesterday? Good morning. Very nice to meet you. Probably over there. It's okay. I know what treat it is. Because I think this is going to obviously have
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Hey, hello. Long time no see.
Yes, I know.
Good morning. I'm Stu Eisenstadt. Thank you very much for coming. The Atlantic Council began its work on Iran 8 years ago, recognizing, I think, before many others, the pivotal role that Iran played in the Middle East and anticipating the need for American policymakers and Americans in general to better understand Iran in order to formulate pragmatic solutions to regional crises. Over the years, we've held literally more than 100 events, published more than 24 issue briefs, and reports that have examined everything from Iran's regional activities to its nuclear program, its domestic politics, and its record on human rights. We've met privately with leading Iranian officials, including 3 times with Foreign Minister Zarif, the chief negotiator of the JCPOA, as well as leading economic officials and the head of the central bank during the IMF World Bank meetings. Our work began as an Iran task force chaired by myself and Chuck Hagel and brilliantly directed by Barbara Slavin. Following the implementation of the JCPOA 2 years ago, our task force morphed into an Iran advisory board still under my chairmanship. Iran continues to implement the JCPOA while continuing other activities that are obviously of concern to the United States and to our allies. However, the Trump administration, while waiving nuclear-related sanctions, has harshly criticized the nuclear deal and threatened to withdraw unless it's substantially changed. Just last week, President Trump said that this was, quote-unquote, the last time he would renew the waivers. The administration's hostility toward the agreement has had a chilling effect on European investment in Iran and pushed Iran further in a direction that it started following while sanctions remained in effect. Today, with 2 expert panels, we will examine Iran's turn toward China and other Asian countries for trade and for investment, and Iran's strategic relationship with Russia. We're delighted that we're again co-hosting this event with the New York-based Iran project that's been led by Ambassador Bill Luers, my dear friend, and by Ambassador Tom Pickering, my colleague and dear friend. And this Iran project has been a great partner of ours. So I think with no further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Bill. Mr. Ambassador, thank you. And we appreciate the partnership that we've had with you. And I want to thank all of our guests for coming and for contributing to today's event.
Thank you, Stu. Before you leave, let me thank you very much. And Barbara for helping put these together for the last several years. The Council has been a partner of ours at least once a year to try to tell U.S. policy having to do with Iran and the region. Let me just tell you a minute about what the Iran project is. I've never said this before. But the Iran project is a small organization. The wisdom and expertise and experience that goes into it through people like Ambassador Tom Pickering, Frank Wisner, Stephen Heinz, who's president of Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Suzanne DiMaggio, Jim Walsh, Jessica Matthews, Paul Pilar, and Richard Nephew, all have been core to what we do. Most of us have been around together for 15 years. Everyone but me is a volunteer and working almost every day on developing our policies. Without the core operation we have, we would be nothing. And Tom is certainly at the center of that core. And then we have about 50 others who support us. And when we do one of our statements, not only is every one of the core members involved in the drafting and the shaping of it, but very often of the 50 people we have signing up to endorse what we say, half of them have got a word to say and change the document. So it's been, for us, an exciting venture of cooperation. When we started this project with the Atlantic Council, which began a few years ago, the United States had led 7 nations to negotiate and conclude the landmark nuclear agreement to close all paths to Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. Today, the U.S. is retreating from that commitment rather than drawing on the possibilities of working with our allies and global cooperation to constrain Iran's other disturbing activities in the region and prepare for the possibility that they may violate the agreement. We now have gone a different direction. We also seems to have given up any interest or possibility of negotiating with Iran, finding common solutions to common problems. And we have common problems in the region. And today, it seems that our approach to Iran has been to focus our attention on them being the enemy in the region. And in fact, we have a military commitment, presumably, to addressing the question of how do you constrain, push back Iran, which has changed completely the dynamic of the U.S. role in the Middle East. It has diminished the role of diplomacy and political engagement. It has left us on the sidelines of solutions being sought for Syria and Yemen, never mind the future of Iraq. And Iran has come to symbolize, I think, represent the symbol of America's decline in its ability to and wish to influence the politics of the region. And it's ironic that when we started this years ago, Iran was the sort of designated enemy of the world, and we were going to try to bring it back in line. And today, they're the center of world thinking. So Barbara's idea to bring together Asians and talk about the Russian relationship is we think will offer a contribution in terms of pointing out not only what the absence of the United States means politically, diplomatically, and commercially in Iran, but also the opportunities that it presents for the region to see an Asian dimension to the development of the region. It's a sad moment in many ways for those of us who pursued American foreign policy most of our lives, but it's also an interesting moment for the reallocation of attention to Iran on the part of the world. Thank you very much, Barbara, my partner.
Appreciate it. I'm going to be very brief so we can get to our excellent panels. I'm Barbara Slavin, and I direct the Future of Iran initiative here. We decided for this event not to have the usual suspects, namely Washington people who all know each other talking to each other, but to actually go to the region and bring people who are true experts in the field. And I'm just thrilled that we've been able to pull this off. So I'm going to just briefly mention them. You have their biographies. First, let me say I'm sorry that Amir Hanjani, a senior fellow here, was not able to moderate the panel, and so the director of the South Asia Center, my colleague, Dr. Bharat Gopalaswamy, has kindly agreed to moderate the panel. We have three wonderful individuals. Wu Bingbing, who's associate professor and deputy director, Department of Arabic Language and Culture at Beijing University, and the director of the Institute of Arab Islamic Culture at Beijing University. We have Sachi Sakanashi, who is a former Japanese diplomat stationed in Iran, now manages the research group and is acting director of the Jimmy Center, Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. She's very, very well versed in this area. And then finally, welcoming back a former intern at the Atlantic Council, Sumita Narayanankuti, who will talk about India and Iran. She's now an associate research fellow at the South Asia program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. So I'm really looking forward to hearing them. I encourage people to tweet at the hashtag #ACIran. I want to thank Bill Lures for his collaboration once again, and also the Plowshares Fund and others for their gracious support for our Iran program. And final note, February 2nd, we will present new polling results from the University of Maryland, done after the protests in Iran. And February 12th, we will have a broader event on Iran's political future. As you know, there's been a lot going on in that country. So with that, let me invite Bharat and our other speakers for the first panel to come up. Thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks for all your efforts and leadership on this issue, and I am definitely pleased to belong to the club of unusual suspects, and along with me I'd like to invite the other unusual suspects from all over the world. And as Barbara mentioned, this is an exciting event for us, that we've gone beyond what we usually do, and we hope to do more of this going forward. And I think this is also exciting for us from my point of view, from the countries and the regions that I focus. And this will serve as a bridging point for us to do more activities collaboratively. Having said that, you have people who have come far away, and I don't want my comments to stand between their way and their expert comments. And the ladies have agreed to let the gentleman first today. And we wanted to put the colleague from China on the spot. The floor is yours. I invite you to deliver brief introductory remarks, and then if you could keep your comments short for 5 to 7 minutes, and then I'm sure we have a very inquisitive audience, and there will be a lot of questions, and there is a lot of curiosity. So the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the Atlantic Council for inviting me to this seminar. First, I want to talk about our understanding about the situation in the Middle East region. Actually, there is a comprehensive strategic competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's not only sectarianism, or it's not sectarianism. Actually, this comprehensive strategic competition includes 5 dimensions: domestic political system, regional security policy, foreign policy, social, religious affairs, and also economic technology issues. So, I mean, if we only understand this as some kind of sectarianism, I think it's a misunderstanding. It's just one dimension, or even, just one symbol of this competition. Certainly, there's a shift of U.S. policy in the region of the new administration to consider Iran as the main threat in the region, and also try to strengthen the traditional alliance in the region, especially Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. So I think, this kind of policy can make the strategic comprehensive competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia more intensified. To make this situation in the region, more in more tensions. Especially this policy doesn't only consider Iran as the main threat, but also to some extent try to marginalize Turkey also. So I think Chinese position is different from this. China doesn't want to take side with anyone in the region. China wants to keep a balanced relationship with everyone in the region, including Saudi Arabia, including Iran, or a balanced situation between Shia and Sunnis, Arab countries, non-Arab countries, Islamic countries, non-Islamic countries, regional powers, or middle-sized or small-sized countries. So I think Chinese policy is a no-enemy policy. We want to be friend of everyone in the region. And also, we think the cooperation between major powers outside the region, like China, US, Russia, Europe, are also very crucial to the stability and prosperity of the region. So in regard to Iran, I think China's position is very clear. We support the JCPOA, beginning from the nuclear negotiation till now. So China always opposes the deconstructive sanctions against Iran, and also any military intervention in Iran. But also, we don't support any efforts by Iran to own nuclear bomb. So we think this JCPOA is a perfect example of a negotiation and peaceful solution to find a way, for the regional problems. That's why China wants to keep the JCPOA and consider JCPOA is an example for further efforts, to deal with the problems in the region. In regard to the recent protests in Iran, I think Iran's political system is fairly stable, based not only on the Islamic value, based on the tradition of Iran and also the 12 Shia Islam tradition, but also represents democracy. So the combination of Islamic value and democracy make Iranian system stable and can face the challenges. So the socio-economic challenges now is very severe in Iran. We know that the demographic structure featured nearly half of the population under 30 years old, and also a lower industrialization level means to create enough jobs for youth is very difficult. Actually, in Iran, every year there should be at least 1 million jobs created for the young people. But actually, to find a solution of such a challenge is very difficult, not only in Iran, but also I think in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, they have the same problem. So in this sense, I think the Rouhani administration has done a fairly good job. Actually, the inflation rate has been reduced from more than 30% to less than 10%. And also, we think, some economic growth has been achieved. In regard to the reconciliation of the political arena, we can see the reformists have been brought back, and also in the security in the region. But in regard to this nuclear deal, I think Rouhani has been very disappointed, and also many of the Iranians. So in this sense, we saw, this protest emerging in many small and middle-sized towns, except Mashhad. But in Tehran and this Tabriz, we didn't see any large-scale protest. So it means that the main middle-class people in Iran still think the Rouhani administration is doing very well. So that's why I think we only see this protest lasted less than 1 week. So in China, we think, based on this Silk Road idea, or we call it Belt and Road Initiative, Iran is a very important partner for us in the region. So we have talked with Iran about many projects, especially Iran is a founding member of AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And also we discussed about high-speed railway projects, some harbor development projects. But now most of the projects are only MOUs. So it means there still a lot should be done between China and Iran. Thank you very much.
And you want to go next?
Yes. Since Dr. Wu has placed the strategic context and the region also in place, I'll dive straight in. And my remarks would focus on first what drives India's bilateral relationship with India today, what are the key pillars here, what has changed in recent years, particularly with the nuclear deal in 2015, and a very short-term outlook given the uncertainty of that very same nuclear deal. So let me first frame the India-Iran relationship as viewed in New Delhi. So one of India's major relationships, this is one of India's major relationships in the Middle East, the other prongs being one, the GCC countries, and two, Israel, as Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit this week illustrates. It is multi-partisan in the Indian context, that whether it's the Congress party in power, its coalition, or the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is currently in power, view engaging Iran equally important. And as the Modi government sees it today, Iran falls very much within India's immediate neighborhood, its first circle of interaction. It in fact places one end as Iran and the other as Myanmar, and primarily these two countries come in because of their connectivity projects that India is pursuing here. And this brings me to the primary pillar that drives India's relationship with Iran today, and that's connectivity, where the cornerstone project is the development of the Chabahar port and road or rail links that connect it to Afghanistan. Now, Chabahar is located in the southeastern province of Sistan va Baluchistan and faces the Sea of Oman. And this port, when connected with road or rail links to the border town of Zahedan on the Iranian side, and then crosses over the Afghan border to Zaran. So this is pretty much mapping out that route. The reason this port project is important to India is because it helps India bypass Pakistan and promote economic interests and the stability of Afghanistan. Using Pakistan as a transit route has not been a viable option so far. The bilateral contract for this port project was signed in May 2016 when Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Taron. And at the same time, what was signed was a trilateral agreement between India, Iran, and Afghanistan, a first of its kind and scale between these three countries, where goods would be shipped from India to Chabahar and then transported, as I said, through the route into Afghanistan. And this route became operational in October last year. Now, coming back to the port itself, I'm just going to toss in some figures to understand how much India's involvement is. India will, one, equip, and two, operate the two new terminals that's coming up. It will spend at least approximately $85 million on equipment. It has a lease currently of 10 years, which can be renewed. And over the past year, the Iranians have worked with a line of credit that India has given of approximately $150 million to build the infrastructure, even as the Indian side is working to find a private Indian player who would manage and operate this port. And that kind of brings me to the caveats. So I said it's work in progress. The port operator is still to be finalized, and this bidding process has taken a year. It was first opened up in April last year and has had 2 rounds because it's just been hard. Showing the investor confidence has been hit with changes in not just rhetoric, but also what we see eminently as policy changes in the Trump administration. Currently, the company dealing on the Indian side is given a March deadline to finally have a bidder, and we look forward to that. A second point to note here is how that one of the first contracts that has been finalized was a crane contract, which ultimately went to a Chinese company because the 2 European bidders that the Iranians were clearly interested in backed out. So I think there are clear some indications that work is in progress, it's happening, but maybe not the players that Iranians would have wanted in the port. So just a quick look at how the other pillars doing, and I'll talk about trade, which will include energy. When you talk about trade, there's a total of about $14 billion at play, this is the 2016 figure. And just to compare, China's trade is at $30 billion, so that's just the difference there. India is, of course, importing more. There's a deficit because India is importing oil, and that's how it stands. In the energy basket, it's today taken a secondary seat, and this is a change that has happened in the relationship in the last 4 years. It's a secondary pillar. In fact, purchases have dropped, and India is quite vocal about its plans for diversification from Iranian oil. India has cut its imports by approximately 20% from Iran in 2017. One of its key players, SR Oil, in fact, cut down as much as 75% last year. And one reason given is because of the stalemate in the negotiations related to a particular gas field, the Farzad B project, which, though India helped in the exploration phase and expected the production, the next phase to be handed to it, that did not happen as planned. And now Gazprom, Russian, Gazprom has signed an MOU with the Iranians to do that. On non-energy trade, it's around 5 billion, and you have rice and tea, which India exports to Iran. Now, a challenge here is that the broader conversation, even if economic or strategic in this relationship, is unfortunately hard. That's a challenge that both governments have faced and continue to face. This is also invariably linked to the absence of substantial people-to-people links and business engagement. There's a great push from both governments to have delegations going either way, but it's still, it's still the feelers kind of phase. Something that helps then is Chabahar, which will generate for India some goodwill, with the Iranian people as well, and employment, which is something that Rouhani, the government's also facing. Just a quick take on the outlook and the nuclear deal, where it's going. So India is working to operationalize Chabahar by the end of this year, and there have been very clear categorical statements from the government that that is the deadline, and it plans to stick with it. How is the US dealing with it? When Secretary of State Rex Tillerson visited India around the second half of last year, he said that the US won't interfere with legitimate business interests in Iran. So how should India view, how much should India invest in that statement is obviously we'd have to find out once, whether, based on what the Trump administration does next. And just a final point, because if it is of interest, India's response to the Iranian protests is basically there has been no official response, and this is because India never comments on internal situations of other countries unless there are significant stakes, like its own people, caught in it. And the Rouhani government is very worried, of course, about losing investors and how this, this internal dysfunction can also play out in the sense of investor confidence. But India remains determined to plow through for now and awaits what the Trump administration's actions will indicate. Thank you.
The Indo-Pacific partner, Japan.
Yes. I would like to thank the Atlantic Council in the very beginning for inviting me to attend this very important and timely event. And I also directly go into the Japan-Iran relations, which is the task that I was given in this event. When we talk about the relations between Iran and Japan, what we have to first look at is the topic of energy. Because Japan's energy self-sufficiency rate is only 6%, which is the lowest among OECD countries. And we depend on import for most of our energy, especially after the Fukushima incident in 2011, when we experienced a disastrous nuclear accident, which made many Japanese people deeply suspicious about the nuclear energy. So we have to go back to oil and gas again. And Iran was the second biggest oil exporter for Japan, next to Saudi Arabia, for many years, until the economic sanctions against Iran intensified. Under the sanctions, Japan had to decrease oil import from Iran gradually, and Iran is now the 5th biggest exporter of oil for Japan. Although diversification of energy sources is essential for a country like Japan, which is almost totally dependent on import for its energy, we actually import 80% of oil from the Persian Gulf oil-producing countries. But for the policy of diversification, it is at least essential to keep good relations with not only Saudi Arabia and UAE, which is the biggest and second biggest oil exporter to Japan, but also try to keep good relation with Iran is very important. And the second thing I have to mention is that Japan-Iran relations have always been affected by US-Iran relations most. US is the most important country for our national security, especially in the changing security environment in East Asia in recent years. And US policy towards Iran, such as economic sanctions, have affected Japanese economic relations with Iran greatly. Once, for example, Japan had to withdraw from an oil field exploration deal because of the deterioration of US-Iran relations. Actually, the name of the oil field is Azadegan, and Azadegan oil field actually was taken over a Chinese company which is called CNPC, and the development is still continuing. Mr. Trump's Iran policy has also, with its uncertainty, effectively stopped Japanese companies from making final investment decisions in Iran, although some companies were really eager to revive their economic activities in Iran after the implementation of JCPOA. In that sense, Mr. Trump's Iran policy has been quite successful, for it hasn't given Iran the benefits of JCPOA that Iran was hoping to gain. But the recent protests that broke out in Iran from the end of the last year has made us wonder if denying the economic benefit of JCPOA to Iran, or even tearing up the JCPOA itself, is really the best policy choice that we can think of. We saw the protest in Iran expand very quickly in a very short period of time, which we think show the deep and widespread discontent of the Iranian people towards the whole system. But we also saw that the protests were quickly dealt with by the security forces. It looked as if economic hardship under the JCPOA emboldened so-called hardliners inside Iran, for they can blame the broken promises by the US administration and criticize the more moderate current Rouhani administration's policy of engagement. We understand that US has many concerns regarding the behavior of Iran today, and we think that is why Mr. Trump is trying to increase pressure against Iran by renewing the waiver for a last time. But we actually wonder if this policy is not increasing tension within the Islamic Republic to the extent that the President Rouhani loses power against the hardliners, who could possibly cause even more instability in the region. Without JCPOA, there will be a fierce competition among the Persian Gulf countries to acquire nuclear weapons, which could further destabilize the region. Without JCPOA, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, for example, might start to expand its economic activities again. Without JCPOA, economic benefits that will be brought to Iran will be much more limited compared even with now, which could cause more instability within the Islamic Republic, for which the hardliners could blame the outside powers' intervention, against which they might even try to retaliate. In this way, losing JCPOA could cause a greater instability in the Persian Gulf region, which we rely on for our energy. The current Abe administration of Japan has emphasized the importance of securing energy supply both in the sea lane and the oil-producing region itself. For the reason that we need stable energy supply, we support JCPOA because we think it will support the Rouhani government of Iran that calls for greater engagement with the world, while at the same time conveying our concern to the Iranians who are ready to listen, we think also is important. We believe economic benefits both of us, for example, Iran and Japan can enjoy, would be a part of the consequences of engagement with Iran rather than further isolation of Iran. the Iranian officials actually always tell us that we are far behind the Chinese or Korean companies in entering the Iranian market after the JCPOA implementation. And it is true that Japan can only proceed with the best speed that we can. But for the reasons that I just explained, we believe economic engagement is also very important for today's Iran. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It is very rare and seldom that the positions of Japan, India, and China are actually congruent. And when it comes to Iran, I find a lot of congruence out here. I mean, what I see is you're all equally invested in energy, infrastructure, and the stability of West Asia, I may put it, as whole. But it's also commendable that you've also managed to maneuver the respective countries' relationships with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran with deftness and great deal of skill and diplomacy. And you also have been able to maneuver your critical relationship with the United States as well. So if there were a single lesson about how do you deal all these four countries that you were to give to your U.S. interlocutors, what would that be? And I will start with China again.
You mean U.S.?
Yeah, and I also have to tell you that one of the the disruption has been a theme in the last 1 year in the United States. But China has been a disruptor in the sense that you have opened up the international order. And and there is an opportunity for you to take responsibility and deal with this situation, that the Middle East does not go into further turmoil than it already is. So if you were to advise your U.S. interlocutors on how to go forward with the situation that you currently have, what would that be?
I totally agree with my friends from Japan that Iran should benefit from JCPOA. So this can strengthen the moderate forces inside Iran and can make Iran feel more secure in the region, and then can initiate real ideas about regional cooperation. So just last week in Iran, there was a conference called Taron Security Conference. So most of the Iranian leaders, including Mr. Zarif and the others, talked about a collective security arrangement in the region, more inclusive, and also from the region discuss about the problems in the region. So I think this JCPOA is very important. But the real problem that Iran didn't benefit a lot from that. We Chinese also felt this pressure, because still it's very difficult for Chinese companies to invest in Iran, even after the JCPOA has been implemented. It's because Iran still cut off from the international financing sector. So I think to continue the efforts to make Iranian people benefit from the JCPOA, to make the Iranian moderate forces to benefit from JCPOA is very crucial. So please keep the framework of JCPOA and make Iranians really benefit from this.
Who would want to go first?
I'm hoping that what you've just heard here from the Japanese, Chinese, and yes, the South Koreans that Sachi mentioned, and the Indians, this is what is also being communicated to the Trump administration. I had also written a small piece in February last year when the rhetoric got stronger, and just after the inauguration of Trump in The Wire, where I sort of hoped that the Asian countries could maybe not lobby, but actually be louder, or at least in private be much louder with the U.S. administration on how this works and actually benefits Iran, not just Iran, but the region. And as you said, if it's the Asian century, etc., Iran is seen very much a part of that journey as well. And in India's case, as I mentioned, it's quite clear that India will proceed. It's trying its best, and if Secretary of State Tillerson's comments or any suggestion, if legitimate business interests can be preserved, then there should not be ideally an issue with even Chabahar progressing. And I'm just hoping that when the next round of waivers come, is that whether that caveat that still applies, or does it, and I guess it helps India in a sense that it's reduced its imports, but it can focus on getting Chabahar right. And I think this is very clearly conveyed to the administration here.
Yes, Smita just mentioned about legitimate business interest in Iran. I think during under the Obama administration, there was an effort to promote so-called legitimate business interest of like Japan, China, India inside Iran, because I think the Obama administration thought that it is important to actually for the Iranians to feel the benefit of JCPOA. But I think, I think the Obama administration tried to clarify what a foreign company can do or cannot really do. I mean, in the form of like frequent asked questions and answers. So there are many kind of information that were provided by the US government for the companies who want to go and work in Iran. But I think after the Trump administration, I mean, since the start of the Trump administration, that kind of effort has, we think, stopped. And I think it is causing difficulty for the companies that have interest in Iran. But at the same time, we sort of understand that the Trump administration, President Trump, has his own priorities or has his own concerns that I think he hears from his ally in the Middle East, such as like Israel or Saudi Arabia, because we hear from both of them as well, like Israeli officials or Saudi officials also come to Japan and they tell us, like, it is not the time that you can keep friends with both of us. Both, you mean, like, if you want to be with us, I mean, it's either with us or with them. And it's very new kind of approach. And we have been experiencing that approach. And I think, but from what we experience, we think it is not so important for the Trump administration to maybe change the way Mr. President has been sort of dealing with Iran, well, because of his friends in the Middle East. So it is very difficult to sort of advise. But what I can say is that the huge difficulty is there, like even for the Japanese companies who have strong interest in Iran.
I think you somewhat alluded to things. I think what you were referring to is there is an economic angle, obviously, to Iran, and that serves both the Chinese and Indian interests. But there is also an ideological interest that concerns all these three countries and the United States and its allies in the Middle East. But there is also another important factor that I think you briefly alluded to, and it concerns everybody in the region today, is Afghanistan. And I think directly or indirectly, all of us have an interest, and that could, that has not come up explicitly in the conversation. But Afghanistan is one of the longest and bloodiest wars that the United States has fought. At some day, President Trump will have to supposedly will have to give a victory speech about how we won in Afghanistan. And Iran is a crucial factor for that. And the China. Do you want to comment on it? Because I think there are sufficient leverages that Iran has. And you have with your counterparts in Russia, you have with your counterparts. India has a decent relationship with Russia. So do the Japanese have. So how do you play this out?
I think for China, both Iran and Pakistan have.
I deliberately did not want to mention Pakistan, but you brought it out, that I'll bring it up.
Okay, but I have to say that both Iran and Pakistan have natural influence and historical contact with Afghanistan. It's natural. So we cannot refuse, any neighboring countries to be a part of this, solution, especially Iran. So I think because of this, China and Iran have had some dialogues over Afghanistan. We hope, Iranians' influence over the non-Pashto people, especially Tajik, Hazara, and those Uzbeks, can be positive, to help to stabilize the region, and also to help the Chinese companies and also other companies to develop some economic project in Afghanistan, because the security is always the main obstacle for any foreign company to operate inside Afghanistan. So we don't have any direct methods to protect our companies, in Afghanistan. So we need local partners. So where we find these local partners, maybe not really local, is Afghan people plus some, influential countries inside Afghanistan. I think this is my idea.
I could just touch on 2 points with regard to Afghanistan. And I deliberately did not talk about the security or defense relationship in this context of today's event. It's weaker than when you talk about when Iran and India were key partners to overthrow the Taliban, working with the Northern Alliance. That was a very different era, a very different time, and the Indians are aware that that's not how it stands today. India was very wary when the US announced its withdrawal, and is a bit more reassured now that it's back. A second point would be, we talk about when the Trump administration has an issue with Pakistan, but then the key that Pakistan holds are supply routes. And the other viable option is actually through Iran. So that's come up in the commentary as well, and that's something which I'll just place on the table.
I think Japan is also talking both with Iran and Pakistan about Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is a very complicated problem, and I think Japan also tried to cooperate with India regarding the Chabahar port, as Smita mentioned in her short talk. But after the idea of helping India in the Chabahar port construction project was floated, not much has happened from the Japanese side. So I don't think Japan is being very active regarding Afghanistan at the moment, but I think...
You have a bigger problem right at your doorstep. But I just want to, before I turn to the audience, I just want to drill back. As I see all of you have again leveraged this Iran factor into an economic relationship, and one is that of where you have leveraged Chabahar port. And when it comes to Afghanistan, we've been doing some off-the-cuff calculations. And today, the United States presence in Afghanistan is much lesser in terms of troop presence, is much lesser than what it was at one point of time. Which means my northern supply routes could provide an option at the fraction of a cost, which was once considered expensive. So, for example, if the United States tomorrow chooses to put all its energy in trying the northern supply routes, then you've lost the Chabahar as a leverage. Okay, so what are the? I just want us to think about what are the other leverages that we have in terms of a broader strategy if we want to advocate engagement vis-a-vis Iran. But the floor is yours, and I invite you to. Otherwise, you won't let me go back into my office. It's first.
Thank you very much. Bharat, you're doing a great job, but I feel strange being down here and not up there. I have to ask the typical journalistic question of all three speakers. What happens if Trump does not continue to waive sanctions? How much of an impediment will that be to your continuing these economic relationships? Do you think that you have any leverage, your governments have any leverage with the Trump administration? After all, Trump has good relations, I believe, with the leaders of all three countries to try to persuade him to stay inside the deal.
And I also want to mention, the leaders of these two countries also have excellent relationship.
As I said, I think India's, since Trump's rise, I guess from November 2017 onwards, 2016 onwards, India has been, churning these different calculations, which is why I think even the energy drop. But sticking with Chabahar, talking about Chabahar continuously to the American counterparts, making them very aware that this is on track and we are going ahead with this, is sort of also ensuring that it's not all is lost. Like I said, the operator, the Indian private firm, which has to win this bid, and hopefully by March there will be one, this is the piece that's been worrying me because it's been over a year. Because most private firms in India most definitely are doing business with the United States and would most definitely choose to continue doing business with the US and drop an Iranian project if push comes to shove. I guess the second bit again is how India's relationship, as Sachi mentioned on Japan as well, with the GCC and Israel, and how that plays out, behind closed doors, is a little different in the sense that because India has been partnering with all these three power centers for a while now, no one really questions India's interactions with the other at the moment. So that helps India in a sense to clearly put forth what it intends to do in each country to the other as well. And I think finally, of course, it's sort of crystal ball gazing, and I really try not to look into that if the waiver is not extended. But I think Chabahar will continue. I think that's quite clear. Like I said, the legitimate business interest caveat. How this could change is if the Trump administration sanctions specifically or in some way the Iranian player in Chabahar, that's Arya Banadar, the company called Arya Banadar, which also operates a port in Anzali in the Caspian side. If somehow that gets sanctioned, that's how the sanctions route on which entity comes under siege in a sense. So I leave it as that.
Barbara, to answer your question on that, and I think you also want to remind yourself about India's vote in the IAEA a good few years ago, when there was a deep American pressure to that. So you're not, considering the geopolitics with the way China's rise, the rise of China in that part of the world is very important, and for that American leadership for Indians specifically matter.
For Professor Wu, we've seen a pattern of China backfilling for European companies, other companies that pull out. Sumita mentioned that there's a Chinese company actually operating the cranes now at Chabahar. Do you foresee more of this if Trump reimposes sanctions? I'm thinking particularly of the project that Total had been interested in, where I believe CNPC is also a partner.
I think this energy cooperation between China and Iran will continue. I think during 2012 and 2013, when the sanctions, was imposed there, China continued this energy cooperation with Iran. As my friends mentioned, Sinopec with Iranians, CNPC with Iranians, CNOOC with Iranians, and also we continue to buy oil from Iran. Reduced some percentage, but continued. Now we buy Iranian oil 500,000 barrels a day. So I think we will continue. Even the U.S., doesn't waive these sanctions, and also I think this will also push China to think about doing business with Iran with RMB instead of U.S. dollars, because it's more and more relevant to the issue. And this, if China do business with Iran with RMB, I think this will influence our energy trade with Saudi Arabia and some other countries also. Certainly, I think trade will continue, and also our Belt and Road Initiative will continue. My friends mentioned Chabahar. Actually, Iranians came to China very frequently to talk about Chabahar also. So Chabahar is not just a route linking Indian Ocean to Afghanistan. Actually, it's a gateway of Central Asia to Indian Ocean, because Central Asia is, landlocked. So for us, Iranians, try to argue that Chabahar is not trying to compete against Gwadar. The two could be linked with each other because the distance is less than 200 kilometers. But for us, we think Gwadar is linked between China and Indian Ocean. Chabahar is Central Asia to Indian Ocean. Actually, they're two totally different routes, So we can do both. There's no competition against each other. So all of these things will continue. I think because it's more and more difficult to convince China that we should cooperate with the sanction efforts of the U.S. Because Iran is not violating the deal, I think.
Ambassador, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Gopalaswamy, and the panel. I think it's been an excellent set of very interesting reports. My name's Tom Pickering, and I'll be chairing the next panel. But I wanted to see if I could excite a little more interest in what seems to be a very somnolent reaction to the question of what might happen should we fail to waive sanctions in the 4 months that come up. Just to paint the picture, you are heavily dependent on energy. The idea that the sanctions waiver would not produce either further sanctions or, to take it a step further, maybe even a naval quarantine, makes Charbahar and other Iranian ports and the transport of energy highly problematic. The second question is, of course, were sanctions to be waived, it would be a violation, not to be waived, it would be a violation of the agreement. And the JCPOA would no longer be in force. And at least on one reading, Iran could further spin centrifuges and move back down toward the route that you all portrayed as being potentially the nuclearization of the region. Or alternatively, Iran could go with the Europeans and perhaps with the Asians and seek a way to isolate the United States, which would mean the president would face no sanctions potential internationally to carry out his stated objective of, quote, improving the JCPOA. This brings to the front energy problems, Middle Eastern dislocation, and even worse, potential conflicts, Saudi Arabia and Iran, with the U.S. trying to hold Saudi Arabia's coat and even more, Israel potential involvement. These all are, in my view, more extreme threats for the future of Asia, China, Japan, India, than you have allowed us to believe. And I wondered whether you think I'm overstating the case and what it is your government should do to prevent this particular question from coming to pass, because you have, in many ways, as a result of today's panel, convinced me you have at least an equal interest with the Europeans in continuing the JCPOA. Isn't there some path forward here? And I apologize for the length of my discussion.
I'm actually excited by your question. I'm tempted to answer it too, but I want to turn to the guests out here.
Any answer is welcome.
Who wants to?
Please.
If Mr. Trump doesn't waive the sanctions in May, it will put Japan in a very difficult situation. Unlike China, Professor Wu said everything will continue regarding China. In case of Japan, I think Japan hopes to continue oil import from Iran, but about the businesses or possible investments, they'll all be gone, that's for sure, because if Mr. Trump doesn't waive the sanctions, it means that Mr. Trump is telling the Japanese companies also to choose either US or Iran. And the size of the business that Japanese companies are doing is just uncomparable, much, much bigger in the United States. And it is almost impossible for any Japanese company to choose Iran vis-a-vis the United States. And there is also this problem of financial restrictions as well, because US is the country of dollar, and when the use of dollar is restricted, then for the Japanese businesses it should be totally difficult, and unlike Chinese companies which might be use another currency. So in case of Japan, Japanese business interest in Iran will have to fade away very quickly if the JCPOA is gone. But about the oil, Japanese government will try to keep importing. But about the difficulties that might come after the not signing of the waiver, I don't think Japanese government is really ready to sort of have really thought about that level of danger happening in the Middle East. At least I think the Japanese government is thinking that the European countries will try to save JCPOA in we don't know what way. And about the question before asked about the leverage that we might have. I mean, regarding Japan, because Japan was not a part of the P5+1 to begin with, I think it would be very difficult to sort of to use any leverage regarding the future of JCPOA. So I think Japan will only have to adapt to the new situation, and that's going to be a difficult situation for companies.
I think the JCPOA is crucial for the region because it offers a platform for Iran to discuss with the major powers. I think, if President Trump refused to waive the sanction and continue the policy to regard Iran as the chief threat and to strengthen the traditional alliance with Saudi Arabia and Israel, this can, as I discussed, encourage the comprehensive strategic competition in the region. The problem is that neither side of Iran or Saudi Arabia can defeat the other. They can only hurt each other. So this can destabilize the region, tremendously. That's my worry. So we can destabilize Saudi Arabia and isolate Iran and marginalize Turkey, but you can achieve nothing. There is no stability, no prosperity. So my worry is that, all the efforts should dedicate to stabilize this region. Not only Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, but also Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. So if we cannot, stabilize the other Arab countries, Saudi Arabia will always feel insecure and weaken as a weaker side to face Iranian pressure. So it's a big, joint efforts made by different countries, including China, US, Russia, and European countries to stabilize the key regional countries, I think. So that's why I think, to give up JCPOA, is not good for the region. It's just to deliver wrong messages. If you can not really defeat Iran, so just make Saudi Arabia feel it has to be more aggressive in Yemen, in Qatar, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, even in other issues. Is that for the interest of the U.S.? I don't understand. But definitely it's not good for China.
So with regard to India, since it's doesn't fall into the basket of, let's say, Japan or South Korea with its closeness as a U.S. ally, the first thing, and this is India's nightmare scenario, if the Emiratis and the Saudi Arabian, if the Saudis, you have the GCC crisis happening within themselves, and you have an inter-Iran Saudi play out. And with 7 million Indians in the Gulf region, this is India's nightmare scenario. And I have asked this of foreign affairs officials at the top. No one really. This is a question they really don't want to talk about. It's something that they will prevent as much as possible. An evacuation plan of that size is just it can't be considered. And that brings second to when India did have to choose in the past. When India was in 2011, the Obama administration sanctions, which were the harshest. India did choose to not deal with Iran as much as it would have liked to, and in the meanwhile has also expanded its engagement with the GCC considerably. If you just take the UAE, just in economic terms, trade is 50 billion, and they're aiming for 100 billion by 2020. And just with the people there, and the diversification of relations between these countries, it's if I've placed the cards on the table, it means if push comes to shove, we know which way India may actually be forced to tilt. And third, if I could just, like you said, Chabahar port is, in today's terms, so we're looking at a short term, right, short to medium, it's still very insignificant. If only it's the route to Afghanistan that India has pitched, and what the previous administration also cushioned the blow of this route by basically saying it's in the core interest of Afghan economic stability that India can do this and Iran can work with it. And so it's still a very small piece which can be discarded if that's what is needed.
Bas, if I may want to just add on that point. I think it would certainly put the Indians in an awkward spot, but not on an impossible spot. Okay, the second question, what concerns the Indians today? It's primarily the rise of China, or China's, as the Indians would portray it, China's penchant for microaggression around the region. The second is terrorism around the region, and that certainly emanates from its neighbor and the United States' policies vis-a-vis Pakistan. Third is the stabilization of Afghanistan. And as she pointed out, the Indians have considerably built out their leverage with Modi is on his trip to Palestine in the next few months. On his way back, he's stopping by Abu Dhabi. He's getting a land for a temple, and there is a $11 billion investment fund that's been set up by the Abu Dhabi, the Emirati government towards the Indians. So and you want your diversification of energy exports, you're going to get it from around the world. You want infrastructure, the Japanese are building bullet trains. In fact, they're doing joint business with the Chinese on many of communication projects around the world as well. The Chinese are bailing out an Indian billionaire, to that extent. So, and what you want is you have a burgeoning relationship with the United States of $100 billion. Or 120, 25, however you want to classify it. And your aim under Kerry framework was to take this to $500 billion. The U.S.-China trade is at, let's put it this way, the U.S.-China trade is at $800 billion. The U.S.-India trade is at $120 billion, right? So when you're looking at that potential and you're making an objective calculation in the National Security Council in Delhi, you have to make some tough choices when you rise up on the world stage. Have the gentleman there. Sorry, Bill.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. With a panel of expertise, I'd like to pose this question. A thought that's guiding the U.S. policy is the following. The problem with Iran as a regional troublemaker, as we see it, is deriving from the impetus coming out of the Iranian Revolution. So that's, you mentioned the topic of hardliners. And so the calculation is, to the extent that Iran makes a turn away from that radical tradition, it will be less of a regional problem. The issue of regional troublemaker or potential regional hegemon will go away. I think perhaps that's a wrong reading of the situation. So this is what I would ask. An alternate view would be the view that apparently Rouhani has. Mainly, we can move along, liberalize things to a certain extent, keep up with the times, and still claim our position as, a renewed major power in the tradition of Persian history. So which would you go along with there? I mean, of those two alternatives? Because the second one is definitely rejected by the government here.
I think New Delhi agrees with the second one and is working towards helping Rouhani realize that in any way possible. In fact, Rouhani's one of his first mantras was also connectivity, and he championed it all around during his tour of Central Asia. So it fits in when the Modi government pushed for this project harder. It fit in very well with what Rouhani had promised his people as well. In fact, he also went to Chabahar and promised jobs, and there was a whole thing. So this definitely fits in very well with helping the Iranian government and relieve some of the tensions on the ground as well with unemployment and youth unemployment in particular, and just those emotions, I think.
Actually, I don't agree with the idea that Iran is a troublemaker in the region. On the contrary, I think Iran is taking a defensive position in the region, actually. For example, Iraq war is not, Iran wanted. Actually, Iran was very worried, but it was imposed to Iran that Iran has to face a new Iraq. So Iran, had designed some policy, very successful, that to make friends with everyone, with Kurdish forces, with all the Shia forces, including the Supreme Council, Sadrist movement, Sistani, and also the other forces. So this strategy was very successful. So it's a defensive and responsive position. In Syria, I think the same thing. Let's really, go back to the Syrian crisis broke out. So Syrian government, is a kind of leftist Ba'athi regime, and Iran is the Islamist forces. So actually, they were not naturally the allies to each other, but only the crisis of Syria pushed the Syrian government totally dependent on Iran. So this strengthened the relationship between Iran and Syria. And also, I think in Yemen, I don't think the Houthis, had very strong relationship with Iran before the Yemen civil war. So think about Qatar, right? Qatar, had a totally different position in Syria from Iran. And then after this pressure from the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Bahrain, so Qatar, actually had a closer relationship with Iran, and Iran is considered as the largest beneficiary of this crisis. So I think all of this means Iran, takes a defensive position, but Iran has designed a successful strategy to face these challenges. So I don't think, Iran is a troublemaker.
I don't think you can say that Iran's approach is completely defensive. We agree that Iran's attitude was at first passive, because the U.S. Military attacked Afghanistan or Iraq. They just destroyed Iran's arch enemies, and so Iran was suddenly without enemies on its both borders, and so it was a new situation. And after the Iraqi war, U.S. military came to stay in Iraq, and it was also a new situation for Iran. But then Iran, I think, started to capitalize the new situation quite well. So in the beginning, maybe it was very passive, but then gradually, I think some of the Iranian policy became kind of more aggressive, which is, I think, worrying Saudi Arabia. And we think that basically Iran and Saudi Arabia are fighting to sort of expand each sphere of influence within the region, because the regional order was sort of thrown into flux after the Iraq war, and now they are still in the middle of process of establishing the new order. And in that kind of process, you cannot be just defensive. You have to be sometimes aggressive. Then they are playing the games with these both attitudes.
Bill, I'll come back.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Congratulations bringing these people here to tell us so much that we don't know. I'd like to go back to American power, which has been exercised in the Middle East. And our most important source of power is the American dollar in the U.S. Treasury. It's not the military. And I wonder to what degree this particular sanctions kerfuffle that we're coming back to again in dealing with Iran raises the issue that has been around a long time about alternative reserve currencies. Professor Wu, you talked about the fact that you will be arranging for trading with your currency with Iran. I know the Europeans are looking for ways to set up separate banking facilities which do not depend on the US dollar. I suspect that the Russians for years have wanted to have the dollar not be so dominant. To what degree, I realize corporations have a big interest in trading with the United States, much larger than trading with Iran, but to what degree does this set of problems that these three countries are facing raise again the issue of seeking an alternative currency to the US dollar?
Who wants to go first? You want to go first?
No.
I don't think China want to, use Chinese RMB as a full alternative of US dollar. Just under the pressure, as I mentioned, of the sanction against Iran, we have to think about to have energy trade with RMB with Iran. But this can have some pressure over Saudi Arabia. That's the logic. But only because of this. I don't think China has any intention to destroy the US dollar as a global currency, I think. It's very clear.
You have a lot of
Yes, I think China still buy a lot of U.S. bond. I think it's very clear.
You?
So in the case of India, we did have a rupee mechanism in place after the 2011 sanctions. So it was this branch called UCO, and a branch in the bank called UCO, and a branch in Kolkata, which was handling payments. But as we also mentioned, it's not, I don't think neither India and particularly the Iranians don't like this arrangement, because the money stays there in India. And in fact, in 2016, before Modi visited, one of the first things they had to get out of the way was ensure that Iran got a big chunk of that money back, because they were complaining about it. And India's circulated money through Halk Bank, which I'm guessing is, if it also gets, I mean, it could also be sanctioned. I mean, if this, yes, they have been in trouble. So that's not an option. And I believe there are a few through Dubai, but obviously now that is not an option either. So yeah, this is, it does get dicey. It does get dicey, the situation.
In case of Japan, we also conducted our energy trade in yen, only because use of dollar was prohibited. So we had to go for another currency and try to use euro as well, but then we settled with yen. But now that the JCPOA is there, we want to use that yen. But then Iran seems to want to use it in euro. So because euro is more usable than just yen. So yen does not have such power at all. And I think at the moment, no currency can really replace US dollar. And that's why this financial restriction is so powerful for all countries in the world at the moment.
Well, I just wanted to add on to this. I think the power of sanctions is not in the currency alone, but the naming and shaming. And today what's working with Pakistan at some levels is the naming and shaming. Some would argue that it's not working, but the fact that you're a sanctioned country does mean a lot in your there are reputational costs to being sanctioned and being called a state sponsor of terrorism. So that works in that part of the region with certain countries. And that's why you get a hostile reaction every time you put them on some kind of a list. The next thing is, what America has done since 1945 is we've ensured a predictability and certainty in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific and along the Middle East. And when you disrupt that predictability and uncertainty, people do not know what's in store for them. And that's very disturbing. Today, if you look at most countries in the Asia-Pacific, you're economically aligned with China. China is the locomotive for your future growth. But security terms, many of them are aligned with the United States. So when Trump talks about obsolete alliances, the first thing that sends shivers down the spine of these countries. So
what if it's no longer an issue of Iran being the pariah and shamed, but Iran being the victim and punished by the United States, contrary to the interests of Russia and India and China and Japan?
Yeah, and I think the adjustment to that kind of a calculation amongst countries will take some time, and there will be divergences of opinions, and you might have some on this side, some on the other side, because today, you've primarily disturbed the world order by saying you're not going to invest in the alliances in the same way. When you say America first, why do you have the rest of the world coming here and saying, hey, what does this mean for us? Correct? And you all know what kind of a disruptor America is, but you have learned to live with that kind of a disruptor. And you're fine paying the costs of that disruption. But are you willing to pay more costs? America has been a security guarantor at the end of the day for Japan, for many countries in the Middle East. And everybody is keenly watching what comes out of the nuclear posture review in a couple of weeks. So all this matters, and yes, you can make one country a victim. Today, let's take the case of India, for example, right? India was a sanctioned country in 1998, and you were an ambassador there. And at that time, during your days, the way India is treated in 2018, it's a strategic partnership. Look at the huge shift. And that's been a change in geopolitics, but still the adjustment to having India as a partner, you're not friends, you're not allies, how do you deal with a country where you're not friends or not allies is a huge adjustment. In my description, India would be a country with friends with benefits. Okay, but what are those benefits and what are those friendships that you get in return in dealing these countries are important questions to ask. And these will be the questions that your own Middle East allies will ask with what is the United States' commitment to its, how far will you go? The lady there.
Hi, Negar Mordhazavi from Iran International. This is a follow-up to Barbara's question. Could you speak more of the diplomatic avenues that are available or have been used? Because we know the Europeans have lobbied Washington, both the administration and even U.S. Congress, really extensively, and they're somehow credited for saving the deal up until now from this administration. Has there been any diplomatic engagement from your countries with the U.S. side? And also, what about the Iranian side? How have the Iranians engaged these Asian powers? You spoke of Israelis doing some diplomacy on the reverse side. What about the Iranians? Thank you.
I'll take one more question, and then I'll, the gentleman here.
My name is Phil Corrado. I'm a retired reporter. I have two questions. China's policy of one belt, one road, and its economic expansion into Western Asia has been a remarkable new development. And I'm wondering how Japan and China see this. For Japan, does it see China's one belt, one road as a challenge, a competition, a chance for collaboration, or something to ignore and just stay focused on the West?
I think you'll get three different answers. I'm glad you asked that question.
All right. Now, the second question is about maybe China's and Iran's common view of history. China and Iran have long, ancient, glorious civilizations. Unlike Iran's neighbors, those are very young countries with a much more fragile civilization, and etc. Would it not be useful for Iran to stabilize and promote the stabilization of Iran so it could help promote the democratization and educational attainments among its neighbors, rather than demonize Iran as a troublemaker? Thank you.
Who wants to go? You?
So the first question, I think the European countries have been very successful in lobbying the U.S. To not impose sanctions after the last time President Trump didn't verify the JCPOA, but waived the sanctions. But I think if U.S. refuse to waive the sanctions next time, it means the death of JCPOA. Iranians understand this very clearly. So they highly evaluate the efforts of European countries, but they doubt if, under the current situation, the European countries cannot protect their companies against the pressure of the U.S., how could, they continue the JCPOA without the U.S. be a part of JCPOA? So I think in this sense, European countries are very important, but the U.S. position is crucial. For China, I think we don't call it one belt, one road, because this can make people misunderstand it's just one physical road or one physical economic belt. So we call it Belt and Road Initiative. So it's totally open and inclusive initiative. It's not a strategy because it's not China unilaterally. It's actually based on joint efforts and also discussions with different countries. So, European countries, Asian countries, now more and more African countries are welcome to be a part of this. US and Japan and India are also welcome to be part of this. It depends on their will. For China-Iran historical relationship, yes, I agree with you that China and Iran respect with each other based on the ancient civilization. We think for the last 5,000 years of history, Iranians can deal with their own problems. So why we think Iranians are irrational, cannot deal with the current situation? They have their own wisdom based on their understanding of the region. The same understanding is also, towards Saudi Arabia. They have their own wisdom also. So this Chinese way to deal with the countries. So I think after the 19th Party Congress, the foreign policy is featured of mutual respect. This is what we mean mutual respect. We believe you have your own tradition and wisdom to deal with your own problems. Thank you.
With regard to India and on the diplomatic front, I'll just talk about like the last year or so when Prime Minister Narendra Modi met President Trump for the first time here in Washington. When they engaged, it was, I think, one of the few meetings where things were followed to the T. You had a press conference, no questions were entertained. But in the joint statement, and this is why I say no question, because you couldn't ask further on that one statement in their joint statement, where it basically said that in accord with India's Think West policy, which is with regard to West Asia or the Middle East, President Trump and Prime Minister Modi resolved to increase cooperation, enhance diplomatic consultations, and increase tangible collaboration with partners in the region. And this, to me, as someone who studies the region, is a very interesting point. It's just that we don't have any further information as to what these collaborations or consultations would involve. But I'm hoping this is a platform where the Indians can also present their arguments on engagement in the region and also maybe temper down some views that come from the other side. Of course, is the bilateral, the India-US bilateral still mature enough on the Iran question? It's still the jury's out on it. With regard to the Iranians, in fact, this week, one of the Iranian consulate in Hyderabad has announced that President Rouhani is seriously considering a visit later this year. Prime Minister Modi had already invited him when he went. But I'm guessing unless there is a significant announcement or some sort of a major platform to bring him on, I'm not sure but that's a statement that's out, and perhaps he'll be visiting this year. And with regards to consultations with the Iranians, it's been very primarily on connectivity. You've had the transport ministers exchanging visits, the railway ministers, exchanging visits. So there's a lot of discussion within the buckets that are working, and that's where things stand. On the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, India's official position is India is not officially joining this venture, particularly because it believes it impinges on certain sovereignty questions, particularly with regard to a territory. Looking at the China economic corridor in Pakistan, it crosses through a territory that the Indian state considers as its own. And for those reasons and others, it's not a part of this initiative. And I'd leave it at that.
About Japanese officials' attempt to talk to the US officials, I think it's basically similar to what European officials have been doing. It's not lobbying, but I think Japanese officials have been telling the US officials that we think JCPOA is working because, Japan supports JCPOA because Iran is in compliance. And about the Iranian officials, I think Japanese officials have also told Iranian officials that Japan supports JCPOA, and also I think Japanese officials have tried to tell Iranian officials about, for example, Saudi concerns about Iranian activities in the region, because as I said in the beginning, Japan is trying to keep good relations with Saudi Arabia as well, and Saudi officials have lots of things to tell the Japanese officials about Iranian activities or Saudi concerns. And I think Japanese officials found it important to found it important for both parties, Saudis and Iranians, to sort of share a common view of what is happening in the Middle East and try to sort of convey the perception of each other to each other. So I think Japanese officials have been trying to play that kind of role as well. And about the Chinese initiative, a One Belt and Road initiative, yes. Professor Wu said about the U.S. sanctions towards Iran that Mr. Trump's decision is crucial. And I think Japan's stance towards this Chinese initiative is more closer to that one, in the sense that China has decided and Japan doesn't really think that Japan can stop it. I mean, but still, I want to say that Japan also, of course, wants to sort of deal with Chinese attempt for a greater expansion, because the Belt and Road Initiative is westward, but China is trying to expand eastward as well in some senses. So I think Japan's attempt to cooperate with India in the Chabahar port has to be understood in the context of dealing with the Chinese initiative expanding westward. But basically, Japan, I don't think Japan is trying to stop China, or Japan is thinking that it can stop China, or I don't think Japan is thinking that way.
If I could just add to what Sachi is saying, India and Japan are collaborating a lot on connectivity, but it's normally pitched as being against the Belt and Road Initiative, but I think it needs to be seen separately. In fact, even the Chabahar port is always pitched against Gwadar, when Dr. Wu stressed that they will collaborate at some point. And you'll have Chinese goods passing through it, because Chinese investment in Iran is just so much that India cannot say no in that sense, compared to Gwadar, where Chinese, where the deal that the Chinese have is much more sweeter. In that sense, India and Japan are also collaborating in Africa. There's a whole Asia and Africa growth corridor project that's it's still in the beginning stages, and that's a discussion that's ongoing, just when we talk about connectivity in China and Japan and India.
I'm just reminded by both your questions. One, the very idea about sanctions and how to implement that sanctions is primarily a Western idea. So can the other part of the world, as other emerging powers rise, can you come up with a political idea to achieve your political objectives, which is not a Western or an American idea, to achieve those goals? And then that brings me to the next point about the connectivity. Again, which in this the Chinese have responded. If you look at the BRI, or One Belt, One Road, China has a vision, the resources, and the intent. Russia probably has a vision, has an intent, but no resources. And America has resources, but no vision or intent. So at some levels, it behooves upon us to come up with this. What is the bright idea that you're giving to the rest of the world? Yes, you build these institutions in 1945, and you have laid out a global trading regime, and then we stitch a TPP and throw it out the window very quickly. And when you see this kind of political uncertainty, what is the rest of the world just waits for an American idea? What is the next big American idea? Yes.
Thanks. Just one topic that hasn't been raised, but is obviously on a lot of people's minds, and that's North Korea. So what connections do you see between the JCPOA and any potential talks with the North Koreans? Should we not even consider the two connected at all? If Trump were, again, not to waive the sanctions again, would that have any impact on this very difficult problem?
I think I'd connect it right away. Because you have, on one hand, you have an agreement with the Iranians, and then the United States stitched its non-proliferation policy in 1967, and successively we've cut deals based on our global geopolitical commitments. And then you're dealing with the North Korean situation, and if you want to talk with them, what is the guarantee that any subsequent administration will honor those guarantees that you have given the North Koreans? Anyway.
Okay. We Chinese think any military attack against North Korea can create a disaster in the region. It can have huge damage on South Korea, and also big challenges to China and the other regional countries like Japan and Russia, I think. So it means, if we can have, peaceful solution through negotiation over the North Korean nuclear and missile project would be the best option. But if, the JCPOA as a the most successful mechanism through negotiation to deal with the nuclear issues could not, sustain. So how could we convince North Korea that we should have the same thing? So we think JCPOA, is very crucial, not only for the region of Middle East, but also for future, the approach of, finding a solution through negotiation.
I think I agree with Bharat's assessment, and I mean, you've given this deal, you've negotiated it, and then you're rescinding the offer. I mean, that's the sort of rhetoric put up, we were too kind with you. And then you look at the Kim Jong-un, the activity there in North Korea, and how that's playing out. And I would, the three of us live in a region where every morning we wake up to the news of something, and it's quite, and your distance from that point is not too far away either. So we're in that region, and how this plays out, and looking at how the Iranians how this deal is going is obviously not a great example. And this is with a country that already has nuclear, weapons, unlike the Iranians who have capped their nuclear program. And of course, that'll come into the sunset clause issue, etc. But that's again, we see how the future of the nuclear deal goes.
There is a consistency in the inconsistency.
Well, yes, I agree with Professor Wu, basically. So.
Thank you. This is Faye Mahtader. I'm an Atlantic Council member. This is a little bit subject different than JCPOA. Has any of these countries addressed the water crisis and environmental crisis in Iran? And has Iran asked any one of these countries for any assistance and help in the future?
I'll take one more question. The gentleman here, he's been.
Vince Alfaso. I just have two brief questions for Professor Wu. I think with China's involvement in Iran and within the region, it does sound like that China's advantage against like maybe the Russians, which is going to be in the next panel, is the economic clout that it has. Does this provide an alternative model for the region? Does it give, does Iran give China some maneuverability to talk with all sides? And my second question is just briefly on the construction boom and the infrastructure that's going on in Iran, especially with the railroads. Most of Iran's oil exports go to China, but how are China's foreign currency reserves, not entirely, but in some way, how is that going to provide jobs for Iranians? How is that going to meet the needs of higher living standards, people exchanges, etc.? Thank you.
Who wants to go?
Okay, I will respond to this question first. We believe that development issue is always crucial for the Middle East, because if you have a desperate generation of youth, what have happened in Egypt, Tunisia, and the other countries, you cannot have stability, you cannot have security. So without development, there's no any chance to achieve stability and security. So that's why China focus on economic cooperation, but not only this trade. That's why we BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, focus on infrastructure construction and industrialization. We try to cooperate with the countries to construct industrial zones or parks to create more jobs. Like in Egypt, we have this Suez Canal corridor zone, and also with some other countries. So this is Chinese mentality. We need development to achieve stability and security. And for China-Iran cooperation, actually, many infrastructure projects, but yet not have any real result yet. For example, China's CREC has signed with Iranians about Taron, Qom, Isfahan high-speed railway, but till now there's no any real work on that. And also some idea about the railroad between Tehran and Mashhad, but still not have any real things. Some other ideas, but all MOU, as I mentioned. And I don't think the railroad of Iran all goes to China. It's also linked to Iran with Armenia. And through Armenia, this can link to Turkey and go to further away. Or even, we can think about Iran-Iraq railway and then linking Iran to Iraq and Syria and Lebanon is another option. We think, we try to have more investment in Iran for industrialization to create more jobs. But as I mentioned, this financing sector is a main obstacle for us to have more cooperation. I think for the environmental challenges to the nuclear projects, the GCC people always come to China to complain about the Iranians project because the Bushehr nuclear plant is just located on the coast. But at the same time, the UAE projects and further possible Kuwait projects, could be also on the coast. So I think is not just from one side, from all the parties, which are intended to develop any nuclear project, because any project needs a lot of water. So it means it's always located on the coast.
You want to go? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Environment is one of the main fields of cooperation between Iran and Japan. And Japan has a governmental organization called JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. And JICA has been involved with a particular project related to the Lake of Urmia. Yes, which is in the northwest of Iran, and I think they are trying to sort of revive the water resources surrounding the lake. And I don't think it is the only project that they are working on. And I think the Japanese government will keep working on the environmental issues all around Iran as much as they can help.
You touched upon Lake Urmia, which I think it's heartening to note that the situation is improving. This is ideally an area a soft area that I do hope India and Iran could also get down to talking on, and not just these harder strategic initiatives. But with regard to another aspect, which is the Hari route and the problem with Afghanistan that the Iranians have, and they've had a good back and forth between the governments in recent months. Unfortunately, the dam that was built, which is the cause of grievance between the two countries, built by India, the Salma Dam. So I do not expect the Indians to really be vocal or get involved in any efforts, regarding that side, the Hari route. But I'm hoping that, the scientific exchange should improve between the two countries.
Terence Taylor, International Council for the Life Sciences. I'd like to thank the panel for its insightful comments. I was slightly distracted by Barbara Slavin's comments from the question I was going to raise, but already one fundamental difference between the North Korea case and Iran is the fact that North Korea has operational nuclear weapons and delivery means. That's a huge difference. But the other one, which leads me to the question I was going to ask, is the domestic pressures from the domestic population, which is, I think, a really big, major difference between the two. Which leads me to Professor Wu's point, and I'd like all three's views on this, about Iran being a force for stability in the region. I'd like to challenge that a little bit and press it a little bit more. I find it hard to understand in the context of the support for the Houthi rebels in Yemen and so on. So it depends where you stand as to whether you see them as a force for stability. I could see this thought deriving from the balanced approach, but I presume balance doesn't mean neutral, and so there must be limits, and I'd like to press that a little bit more. In Iran, in the disturbances, it was manifest that there were concerns amongst the Iranian population about the support the government was giving to external activities like Hezbollah and others. So I'd just like to press this idea of just balance. It doesn't mean neutral, I take it. I can understand the pressures of energy supplies and so on from the three countries represented on the podium. But I'd like you to explore that a little bit more and perhaps try to justify it a little bit more. Thank you very much.
I'll take one more question. Yeah. There's a gentleman there.
Yes, thank you. It's the Russian embassy, Arthur Lukmanov. With regard to the Russia not having resources to promote cooperation with Iran, we have enough. It's about the last visit we had for President Putin. He was in Tehran on November the 1st, and it was trilateral meeting, not just bilateral, Russia and Iran, it was also Azerbaijan. We have so-called Thals corridor, and that's one of the shortest ways to reach via Caucasus, Iran, to India and South Asia over Caspian Sea and Caucasus Mountains, and the railroad we have there to Europe. So we have, and that would be, of course, complementary, and with regard to the work our Chinese partners are doing on their One Road, One Belt initiative. Thank you.
We look forward to your resources. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you that to be balanced doesn't mean we are neutral. Actually, in the Yemen case, China fully supports the position of Saudi Arabia. It's very clear. China's formal position is Saudi Arabia should play the leading role in Yemen, and GCC should play the key role of mediation in the Yemen case. So it means, in Yemen case, we supported the Saudi and GCC position. But the reality is that the Houthis, is a local force. It's not a proxy for Iran. It's very clear. Houthis was there for nearly 1 decade, fighting against Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia, didn't succeed, didn't win, in fighting against Houthis. So now, after nearly 3 years of war, it's very clear that Saudi Arabia doesn't have a clear way out of the crisis of Yemen. I think Yemen has become a bleeding wound of Saudi Arabia. So I think there must be some way for Saudi Arabia, to talk with Houthis, but also to talk with the Iranians about this issue. It's something else. It's not Chinese position. Our position is very clear. And beyond that, I think most of the Iranians understand the security in the region for Iran is crucial for domestic stability and for any economic development, especially after the rise of ISIS and the defeating of ISIS. So it means Iranians' efforts in Syria and Iraq guaranteed the ISIS cannot directly attack Iran. So I think this is now a consensus of the Iranians that Iranians' efforts, either by post-Taron or by militias, are very important for Iranians' domestic security. So I think, I don't think the majority of the Iranians would oppose Iranians' efforts in defeating these terrorist organizations like ISIS, or to guarantee an extent of and regional security for Iran. So I think, in this sense, Iranian government enjoy the support of the majority of the people.
And with that, I want all of you to thank the panelists.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 11.
Okay. Barbara, shall I just go ahead? Okay. Yeah. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for staying on for what I think and hope will be quite a different panel in terms of perspective, but I hope a very interesting one because I have three really brilliant presenters with me. Ted Karasik, who's from many parts of the Gulf and will very much hold up that interest. We're very lucky to have Maxim Suchkov from Moscow, who will give us certainly the inside scoop on how Moscow sees relationships, and Gene Rummer, who thinks often and clearly about policy prescriptions and policy outcomes. And we're going to take them in the order in which they are seated. I just wanted to say a word or two. Thank you, Barbara, for what you have done. Thank you, Bill Lewis, who's been an inspiration and indeed a magnificent leader of the Iran project for now almost 16 years. And it's a pleasure always to work with Bill and to move questions along. Thanks to Fred Kemp, to Stu Eisenstadt, who was here earlier this morning, to Joe Cirancione at the Plowshares for their help and their work. We're in an immediate crisis situation with the president's 4-month deadline that hangs over the issue. We've had a series of popular demonstrations in Iran which seem to be tailing off. We have a U.S. absence from the region, which is a striking and I think significant development. We have efforts to promote and indeed engage Saudi-Iran tensions and more. We have a Middle East that is collapsing indeed of its own initiative and its own weight in many places and in many forms. A more, I think, challenging and indeed more confusing place does not exist. So you're here to find celerity, clear thinking, and wonderful analysis. And the three on my left are going to provide that to you, each in their own way. And we will look forward to your enlivening the conversation in a few minutes with your questions, comments, criticisms, or whatever. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you. Thank you all for coming. And Ted, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to Barbara Slavin and also to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to this very important conference and this table right here. Now, let me start off by first saying that the Gulf states basically look to Russia for assistance in their foreign policy objectives within the Middle East itself. But when it comes to Iran, it's a little bit of a different angle. And the angle really isn't new. It is something that has been ongoing for the last 10, 15 years. And that is that traditionally the Gulf states have used Moscow as a backdoor to Tehran. And because of the confrontation between the Gulf states and Iran itself over the course of the decades. Under King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, Bandar bin Salman was the one, I'm sorry, I'm already doing this. Bandar bin Sultan, yes, I was right, was the individual responsible for the Moscow file. And he was the one, the prince, who was traveling as national security advisor to the king to Moscow, both privately and publicly, to negotiate and try to get into a back door, if you will, to Tehran, to try to negotiate what the future of the Gulf region would look like. This was under King Abdullah. When King Salman came to the throne, things began to change. And as you see with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and what he said about Iran and so on, particularly earlier last year in his interview in Al Arabiya when he said that we would take the fight to Iran itself. This was a direct threat against Iran. Russia saw this activity and has tried to be a in-between actor, if you will, as has been doing throughout the MENA region for the last several years. It's important to recognize that Russia has good to excellent relations with every Arab state and Iran right now. It puts them in the driver's seat. This is why Russia, as a regional power in the Middle East, is at its height right now and could get stronger. The Gulf Arabs see in Russia a partner, but also an enemy. And it is typically this point of view from the Khaliji point of view, the Gulf Arab point of view, that they're trying to formulate a policy of balance and to play powers off of each other. And as Dr. Bingbing correctly said, it's very important to pay attention to the culture and how culture drives policy. The Gulf states see Russia right now as an ally to work with and try to get through to Iran. However, there's a contradiction, as you all well know, right? Because Russia is on the side of Iran and of Hezbollah and other militias, such as the Houthis, from the Gulf point of view. How does the Gulf states reconcile with that? And how does Russia see this as well? So there's a two-way street here. The point is that the Gulf states do see Russia here as someone they have to do business with as Syria begins to settle. We hear discussions about reconstruction. Russia seems to be the manager, if you will, part of the reconstruction. And the Gulf states see Russia in this way and sees Russia as the go-to manager for any reconstruction contracts and development in Syria. This is the way that they're thinking, okay? Might not be reality, but this is the way that they're thinking. And they also are picking up on various ideas of reconstruction that is either based on what they're calling a new Marshall Plan or the Grozny Plan. And the Grozny Plan here is what is really important to pay attention to, because of the way that the two wars in Chechnya in the 90s occurred and their aftermath and the reconstruction of Chechnya. The funding for that reconstruction came from the Gulf. And that is the way that the Gulf states are able to get concessions out of Russia, if you will, or to get favors from Russia. And we might not see it publicly, but they are occurring behind the scenes. And this give and take is very, very important. I'd also like to add one more thing. I'm probably almost out of time, right? Okay, thank you. I'd also like to add here, too, that the way that the Gulf states are conducting their transactional relationships with Russia as it relates to the Iranian question has to deal with sovereign wealth, okay? And I just wrote a paper with Ambassador Adam Airley on this topic on the use of sovereign wealth funds and geopolitics. We're seeing a new phenomenon now that's coming into light because of the geopolitics and the geoeconomic situation with the Gulf, with Russia, and with East Asia and South Asia as well. The use of these sovereign wealth funds as tools of foreign policy are important to begin to look at in a more robust way. In the previous panel, you had a speaker talk about India and about Modi coming to the UAE. Well, the UAE is opening up its sovereign wealth fund to investment into India, and this helps to bridge these two countries together. Russia, Emirates, India, they're all in business together, and they're looking for ways in which Iran can be part of a wider geoeconomic system. From the Gulf point of view, the geoeconomic center of the world is no longer in Europe, it lies in Asia. And from the Gulf point of view, they're looking at Iran and how Iran is going to play with other East Asian organizations and opportunities like One Belt Road Initiative, or, for example, the future of AIIB and its investment strategies, or looking at security organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think here in the West, we look at Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a little bit of a joke. But in the Gulf, they actually take it quite seriously. And we have to be cognizant of these points of view about what the Gulfies are really thinking about Iran and Iran's future and where Japan, China, and South Korea lie in that. The Gulf states do not like, on the one hand, Japan, China, and South Korea doing business with Iran because it's contradictory to their own foreign policy at this time. Instead, what needs to occur is that these countries, the East Asian countries, need to be more cognizant, and I think they are, of these divisions within the region because of the Qatar crisis and where Russia sits in that equation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Max?
I have more later.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank my colleague Barbara and the Atlantic Council for giving me this opportunity to address such a distinguished audience. You know, when I looked at the title of the panel, Russia-Iran Strategic Relations or Strategic Alliance, I caught myself thinking that neither it really describes the current state of affairs between the two, nor it may necessarily, you know, be this desired paradigm of the relationship for the two countries in a foreseeable future. And actually, if I could, you know, further challenge this proposition, it doesn't necessarily have to be a strategic alliance for the two countries to service their interests the best way. And you know, this conventional wisdom of Russia and Iran having the strategic relationship, I think, is coming from three major sources. One is, of course, the current interactions, and I'm picking my words very carefully here, between Russia and Iran in Syria. The second one is this kind of imagined united anti-Americanism that is supposedly uniting the two countries. And the third one is the things that Moscow and Tehran are doing in other spheres, and I'm going to briefly mention all of that. So when we're thinking about Russia and Iran cooperating in Syria and on Syria, I think it's a reflection of some bigger trends, if you will, in the view that Russia and Iran is thinking about one another and about the region. In many ways, Russia and Iran are strategic singles on the international arena and regionally, and they have very strong self. Each country has a very strong sense of self. At the same time, the view that Moscow and Tehran have on the Middle Eastern affairs have striking affinity. And there is this issue that, you know, I think Moscow tends to over-amplify and the United States has to underestimate, is this terrorism threat and the way Russia sees this thing. You know, when you have about 20 million Sunni Muslims in Russia, the domestic concern is actually Salafism, not so much, you know, Shia militias and whatever Hezbollah is doing there. So this is something that's frequently brought up in the debates, in the bilateral debates and discussions in the Middle East. At the same time, by saying this, and here's where I come to this, you know, challenging this proposition that the strategic alliance may not necessarily be the best paradigm to address each other's interests. It is very important for, you know, there's been a lot of talk about balancing, and it's very important for Moscow to keep this adequate balance all the time, you know, without ending up in this kind of quote-unquote Shia camp or being perceived as, you know, doing this. So it is very important for Moscow to steer away timely from some of the things that are important to Iran in the region, but not necessarily important that much to Moscow. And here comes this popular talk about, you know, how Russia is going to choose between Israel and Iran. And my view on this is it doesn't have to choose, because Russian presence in Syria is not about Iran or Israel. And, you know, Israel has very serious concerns about whatever Iran is doing, and I would imagine Russia certainly is aware of some of the things that Iran is doing that are being interpreted by other players as disruptive and toxic actions and whatever. And these concerns should be taken seriously. It's not like, you know, Moscow should negate these concerns. And I would even say that under Putin in recent years, the relationship with Israel has been the best in the modern history of Russian-Israeli relationship. At the same time, you know, when I would say that Moscow is pretty much aware of the desire of Israel and Tehran to use its presence in Syria to the detriment of the other party. So, when you have this context between Putin and Netanyahu, the Russian military is presenting what the good things the Iranians are doing to help Russia fight, the ISIS, Nusra, and some of the opposition groups, kind of highlighting the impact that Iran has in what Russia and Iran see the joint fight against terrorism in the region. Israel, on their side, are sharing some of the intel that shows, how Iran is trying to play Russian presence and how it may be to the detriment of Russia. Besides, there are certain things that there is some serious interest in Moscow too, that are these concepts that look pretty abstract when you think about them, like growing Iranian presence or Shia corridor in across Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, and into like trying to project and connect those to what interests Russians themselves have. So when the Israelis are saying you need to curb Iranian influence there, in my view, not only this is a little overstatement of how much of Russia has influence over Iran on that, but at the same time, there should be kind of this understanding what incentive for Moscow itself is to do that. And when we're talking about this influence in Syria that Iran may have, the very concrete and simple questions are: so is Iran looking for a land, like physical presence and a land corridor? If yes, how much of a threat it is to Russia's own military facilities there? If not, why should we bother about it? If it's a more virtual presence, and the talk is about political influence, then of course the concern for Moscow is how much of a leverage Tehran may have over Damascus or the government in Damascus, be it Assad or whoever comes next. Or also what opportunities it may have for Moscow. It's not only about threats and challenges that are there. Another proposition that is frequently there, Russia and Iran cannot work because they have so many differences, and there are certain differences, of course, in Syria and in particular, and this big thing about the lack of trust. I would say that the lack of trust is kind of a common feature in the region. So this is not like it's not like to say it's not a problem, right? But it's rather a normal. When Putin once mentioned, I think he said it was Shimon Peres who once advised him not to trust anyone in the Middle East, right? So I think he's taken that advice quite seriously, though. At the same time, you have this certainly, historic contradiction, disagreements that are deeply seated in Iran in particular, not so much in Moscow, that is part of the identity and part of the narrative that you just cannot go around it and ignore it. At the same time, in the modern day relationship, the trust can be accumulated through a number of certain steps. And these steps are being taken on the ground in Syria with the unprecedented number of contacts and military and intel exchange on Syria. The two other things, I'll just go briefly so that we have more time for discussion, is this kind of notion of anti-Americanism and Putin's visit to Taron in November. One of the things that Supreme Leader Khamenei told him was that Russia and Iran need to work more closely on quote-unquote isolating America. The meeting was on the JCPOA, but when you come to think of it, the United States is isolating themselves, not so much the Russians and Iranians are doing this, and in the use of dollar that's already been mentioned here. And the idea is to use national currencies more in bilateral and international trade. So that's something to be taken into account. At the same time, I would say that there is a genuine understanding in Moscow-Tehran that you cannot build a sustainable partnership, long-term partnership, only on anti-American ticket, and there should be more meat added. And that thing is where it comes to more bilateral trade, economy, macro level investments, infrastructure projects, and things like this. And this is where I think is key to understanding whether Russia-Iranian relationship is going to be a strategic partnership rather than this alliance, or in how successful it's going to be. And I'll just leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxime. Gene, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm grateful to the hosts for including me in this excellent conversation. I was thinking what I, as a non-Middle East and non-Persian Gulf expert, can add to the conversation, and I've asked myself, what does it all mean for us? And if I had to come up with a bumper sticker or a label for what I'm about to say, very briefly, I would say, from an indispensable nation to odd man out, and vice versa. And this, of course, has to do with the roles that the United States and Russia are playing in the Middle East, or increasingly playing in the Middle East. And I think to really appreciate the extent of changes in the last few years that we're witnessing but have not really fully come to terms with, we need to rewind the tape both historically and step back geographically. And looking at this room, I'm sure some people still remember in 1993, and the image that's really stuck in my mind is the south lawn of the White House in August, if I'm not mistaken, of 1993. And, there is this incredible breakthrough. The Israelis and the Palestinians are coming together under American sponsorship. And there's this man off to the side, Andrei Kozyrev, the odd man out in a rumpled suit. And that symbolizes Russia's role in the Middle East at that time. And I think our thinking about Russia in the Middle East, and really Russia on the world stage, has been so influenced by the experience of the 1990s that it still carries on as the dominant theme in the way we think about Russia in the world. Things got so bad that by the end of the 1990s, I think we were talking about a world without Russia. I'm stealing the title of a paper written by my friend Tom Graham, but this was really a conversation about a world in which Russia does not have a seat at the table on any major issue, and really is marginalized. And of course, at the time, the United States was the indispensable nation. All of that left such a deep impression, both good and bad, in our minds that we still haven't shed that baggage. But I think in the last few years, we've seen a reversal of that, and a significant one at that, with Russia coming back, not just in the Middle East. The Middle East is a prime example, but in other parts of the world where we have not seen its fingerprints or footsteps in ways that it really is manifesting itself that are very significant. Russia is no longer a mere regional power as it was once described by President Obama. Its ambitions are no longer limited to an exclusive sphere of influence around the periphery of its borders, around the territories of the former Soviet Union, as was defined in 2008 by then President Medvedev. We see Russia playing the critical role in Syria. Of course, it was the wedge that enabled it to reposition itself as a major player in the Middle East. But not only that, Russian footprints are all over the Gulf, in Libya in an interesting way that we have yet fully understand, in Egypt, and of course farther away in the Western Hemisphere, we're seeing Russian presence in Venezuela, elsewhere delegations visiting in Brazil and Argentina and so on, but that's beside the point. But really, we're seeing a Russian foreign policy that is unexpectedly agile, reasonably well-resourced, very quick to seize opportunities that appear before it, but also careful not to overreach. Many of you remember probably that in the fall of 2015, the conversation about Russian move into Syria with boots on the ground and planes in the air was all about body bags, the Afghanistan experience, including among Russian experts themselves. Well, here we are. Russia was able to change the course of the war, and now is playing with a very different hand than it seemed to be the case a couple of years ago. They have deployed a very impressive toolkit around the Gulf, using diplomatic engagement to the degree that really, I think, exceeds our expectations. They've used military force, something we're not accustomed to, and trade wherever possible, not on the scale that China can deploy. Of course, we're not talking about the same degree of resources, but still very skillful application of the rather limited toolkit that Russia has, but really quite impressive. And through diplomatic engagement and other tools, they've been able to build a web of relationships around the Persian Gulf and the Middle East that, again, is positioning Russia as the indispensable nation. Iran, of course, is the long-standing strategic relationship. They've seen each other through thick and thin. Friend in need is friend indeed, and I think it really is a strategic relationship, not perhaps in a sense of a partnership, but strategic in which each side realizes the strategic importance of the other to it. For Iran, I don't think I need to explain. It's the patron that has a full seat at the Security Council and is able to exercise its authority to help stand up against the United States. And for Russia, for a long time, it was really the only major player in the Middle East which had a conversation with Russia. Nobody else would talk to Russia for a long time. And power relationships are really important for Moscow. I mean, if we look at how they're building their presence in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, Iran, of course, is a critical power that was there, that will be there. Saudi Arabia, most recently, the kind of warming of relations that we simply did not expect, but also Israel. And as others have said, these are relationships that are not mutually exclusive. They're able to walk and talk to everybody. And of course, smaller states, they're not being neglected either. So we are seeing Russia becoming an indispensable nation here. Not in a way that it can single-handedly resolve any of the problems facing the region, but in a way where Russia has, by definition almost at this point, a seat at the table if any major issue on the regional agenda is to be addressed. And I think a lot of what we're seeing now is either unfinished business left by the United States in the region. There's lesson there, number one, for us. And number two, related to it, or just simply vacuum left as we walked away. This is not to say that the situation is broken irreparably, but this is to say that we better look at the situation in very different terms, and simply telling governments and nations that Assad must go is not enough to make it happen. We are no longer the party that really tells everyone what to do.
Thank you, Gene, very much. Interesting and fascinating new insights, but if I could be a little bit rude with the particular sense of wanting to avoid discussing the wonderful question that Barbara, as a great journalist, asked at the beginning, and I'm going to borrow that question for these three. What, in your view, will be the reactions and what will be the actions that might be taken were the president to complete his promise of failing to waive the sanctions on the JCPOA? Ted, you want to begin?
Sure. Clearly, the Gulf states are against Iran. They're against JCPOA. They want to renegotiate everything. The GCC states, obviously before the Qatar crisis, were arguing that, hey, we need to be part of this P5+1 process too. We need to be able to discuss missiles, ballistic and cruise. You are not letting us be part of this process. They still feel that today, that they were left out of the process. And this is part of the reason that they're behind what drives their policy. They want these missiles and sanctions against Iran, which have come, but more to try to help prevent the spread and proliferation of missile technology. From the Gulf point of view, they see, of course, Iranian hand behind Houthi missiles. They see, for example, Iran and North Korea working together on a nuclear weapon program, plus missile programs. And from their point of view, they see how North Korea is accelerating its missile program as evidence of collusion. That's how they see it. That might not be true, but that is perception. Perception drives much of policy in the Gulf.
Ted,
Thank you.
just follow up.
Yeah.
The Gulf states would rather see Iran with a nuclear weapon and no missiles than the reverse.
No, they would like to see Iran with no nuclear weapon and no missiles. They want to see Iran, obviously.
But they're clearly prepared to trade off the JCPOA in hopes that somehow out of heaven will come a missile ban.
Indeed, they do. And
so
this is part of
strategic thinking is pretty short-sighted in the regime.
I would argue that the strategic thinking is for the Gulf states, and again, we have to be careful here because of the split within the GCC.
We haven't mentioned that, but we'll get to it.
We'll get to it. But the point is that the Gulf states want this to be corrected at any cost. Okay. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. Maxim, что готов?
Well, there are certain things. One, at the official level, I think you've heard Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov saying this is the worst case scenario that Moscow thinks that the United States, pulls out of the deal and employs more sanctions or doesn't have this waiver for sanctions. Secondly, another thing that Moscow is thinking in vis-a-vis JCPOA is it seems to have very strongly linking this to with North Korea, something that Barbara mentioned before. And given, of course, everything that's been mentioned in the first panel, I mean, there are different cases, but the point is in the very deal making and about the United States not being a trustworthy party, that if you pull out of the deal, you'll never get North Koreans get to talk to you and imagine, solving this issue politically. So this is really bad. At the same time, I think there's certainly some political and other opportunities that Russia may see in this. One is the likely growing tensions between Europe and the United States on this particular issue. Secondly, if you have more sanctions, then it means more opportunities for Russian companies and more Russian businesses and the things that I've mentioned before. It all depends on, a lot. The devil is in detail, really, here. And one thing is like what sanctions the United States may go with, and another important point: does the Trump decision to pull out of the deal mean that to the JCPOA? Because the deal may stay, it will be probably, again, in theory, more difficult to persuade Iran to propose some incentive for them to stay. So we'll see.
Gene, what possibilities do you see that Russia would move somehow in light of what we see as the potential Putin-Trump relationship to push hard to keep the JCPOA in place? As Maxim said, our friend Sergei Ryabkov sees this as perhaps the worst alternative. It is the worst alternative. Would there be any action? And more broadly, because Gene, you look at the world more broadly, we've heard from the Asians of their concerns about this action, and we know that there are European concerns. Is there any way in which anyone could take the lead in motivating what would be essentially the international community, less the U.S., over the next 4 months to push on the U.S. to do something different?
Well, as I look at our allies across the Atlantic in Europe, I fear that it's a pretty bleak picture. I think there would be rather universal condemnation of such a radical move by the United States. But I don't know who among European leaders, perhaps Macron, could take the lead in mobilizing the international community and the European allies in particular to impress upon the Trump administration that what it is doing is harmful in so many ways that we're not even going to elaborate them here. I think, as Maxim has pointed out, I certainly don't think that Russia would welcome such an outcome, although I would think there's a silver lining to, I agree with that. But I just don't see, given our own domestic political circumstances, the Trump administration being able to respond to Mr. Putin's overtures. Well, stranger things have happened, but I think perhaps our European allies are best positioned here. And again, I'm thinking about who is in the strongest position here, and Macron seems to be in the lead here.
What about a Xi-Putin cooperative effort?
Well, they could certainly make the case. I don't know, really hard for me to tell how much traction they would have in the White House and in our current domestic political environment. I think it would be, if Xi and Putin, they're not coming to Davos, I don't think, this year, but this would be a wonderful point to make at Davos. How much weight it would carry with the White House, I'm not sure.
Maybe could have tweeted it, but I don't have a Twitter account.
Mhm.
Either of them, so.
Let me just segue to the other, there are many other issues because I mentioned some at the beginning, but the other issue, what clearly seems to be now an effort for the U.S. to polarize the region in a pro-Saudi, maybe pro-Gulf, anti-Iranian approach, which, given the propensity of this administration to think more about war than diplomacy, at least at the top, do you consider this something of a danger? Do you consider what the outcome of an Iranian-Saudi Gulf conflict might be? Do you see this as something that is trenchant and concerning, or more in the area of what is clearly an excess of diplomatic hot air on the other side? Give us your assessment, and I want Maxime and Jean to comment as well on this question, how they see Russia lining up on this potential set of problems.
Okay.
And you can talk a bit about the Gulf divisions if you want, and I'll give you 2.5 minutes on that one.
Thank you. Okay, so the Gulf crisis, as you know, broke out last year, June 4th, and it's still ongoing. This is much more serious than the 2014 crisis, and because of the rise of Mohammed bin Salman and also because of Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, they're the two leaders, youthful leaders who are driving this policy against Qatar, but also driving the policy against Iran. They're putting Qatar and Iran in the same box, if you will, and then lining up everybody else around it. This division that has occurred in the Gulf, to me, is permanent. It has no resolution unless something snaps. And we have to guess what that snap will be, right? That's part of our job. But the point is that with the tensions that are ongoing in the Gulf, that Russia is able to look at this and to be able to play all sides. And I would argue that the Chinese have been able to do the same. But I would like to point out just for a moment that this tension in the Gulf and what Saudi and UAE are doing against Qatar plus against Iran has dangers to it. And one of the dangers we just saw was the selling of the SY-400 short-range ballistic missile system to
air defense
Qatar.
system.
This is an offensive weapon system that was introduced into this Gulf crisis at a time when the Saudis and the Emiratis are having Houthi missiles lobbed at them. Now, is this smart politics? No, it's not. It adds danger to it. So for the Chinese to have sold this system and have negotiated it under the table since 2014 does not play well with Gulf interlocutors. And this is a continuing problem that will help drive Saudi Arabia and UAE further against Iran because they all see them lined up behind
together.
each other. Thank you.
What about the potential for agreement among the Gulf states? What would be something they might react militarily against? And how close are we to that particular red line or that particular trigger point?
It's an excellent question because within the Gulf community, if you will, there is a lot of debate exactly about whether this is a kerfuffle or a real live dangerous situation. I'm of the opinion that it's more of a real live dangerous situation that has the capability to have an accident. And in the last few days, we've seen this info war between Qatar and the Gulf, the ATQ states, anti-terrorist quartet states, talking about Qatari Air Force interdiction of Emirati civilian aircraft. This is a very serious accusation, and this ratcheting up, this environment can create mistakes, and this is what we have to worry about today.
Good. Maxime, what about the Saudi-Iran contention? And you've spoken a bit about it, but where would Russia like to see that process go rather than take immediate short-term advantage of developments? What do you see as a potential Russian strategic view, or maybe there is none?
Well, first of all, I would argue that this scenario, the very worst-case scenario, where the two start fighting each other, is something that Moscow ultimately doesn't want to see in the first place, because it definitely is not going to make the Middle East more secure place. It is very likely to galvanize Islamic constituencies across the region and in the Russian Federation itself. So it's going to create a lot of instability and a lot of headache and a lot of difficult policy decisions that we wouldn't want to have. If it starts, and prevent that, I would say that probably there is this argument that so far there hasn't been a U.S. foreign policy in the region or vis-a-vis Iran per se, but so much of the U.S. agenda in the region is hijacked by the Saudi agenda. And how much, and as some addressed in the previous panel, how much it really suits America's national interest in the first place. And if these tensions, kind of spin out of control and flare up to a war, that's going to be difficult, in my view, for the Saudis actually. And their state stability is not very strong. I mean, you've seen some of the opposition in Iran, but you will probably see this, more hardliners come to the stage, and the people who even the people who've been on the streets several weeks ago would, that'll be a big uniting thing for them. I'm not sure about, how. I'm no military expert. I wouldn't, dare to compare how strong the militaries are and stuff. So, but I would say if it was this big thing, I'm not sure it might be successful for the monarchies.
So you think Russia might be inclined to tilt a little bit toward Iran in a Saudi-Iranian confrontation, in part because they believe that will be the outcome anyway?
No, probably not. My view is that Russia wants to stay of the very regional spats as far as possible. That has to do with the disagreements that Israelis and Iranians had, as I mentioned, and the disagreements that the Saudis and Iranians have, because there is nothing in there for the Russian security interests in the first place. There might be some
a little bit of what might be sage advice to Russians in the Middle East is be careful what you wish for.
Well, in a way, yes, because there is this debate whether the position and the driving seat that Russia is in is the primary objective of the Syria involvement or a side effect to it. But with a lot of assets, there come a lot of liabilities, and I think the United States knows a lot about it, including in the region. So there are a lot of lessons to learn from the previous years of the United States policy. And ultimately, I think this tension is kind of upsetting the very attitude that Russians have toward the region, because when you have these stark divisions, you cannot be neutral. Yes. You will have to take sides, and that's not suiting well this recent rapprochement between Russia and the Saudis.
Gene,
And that's also
your
important.
comments, Gene, on Russia vis-a-vis the Saudi-Iran face-off, and maybe more importantly, what do you see as Russia's strategic objectives in the region as a whole?
Well, as a non-expert on the Gulf region, I find what Maxime said very persuasive, and I'm going through sort of, if I were in their shoes, what I like to see.
Yeah.
And certainly a military escalation is not something that I would want to see there. I mean, there are people who claim that, well, you know, they stand to benefit if the price of oil goes up and so on, but I just think that it's a very simplistic and shallow analysis of how they view the situation. And I think if the things really start flying in both directions, their leverage decreases and their reputation suffers. And there are all kinds of negatives that come out that Maxime has mentioned, so on. So I think their goal, and this is where the second part of your question is to be an interlocutor to a lot of parties. I mean, I think they're aware of the limits of their power in the region and the challenges they face if they get in way deeper than they have so far. So a crisis is fine because that presents opportunities for conversation. Sometimes, if only as a conversation for conversation's sake, but that's important too because the spotlight is on Russia. But once that barrier is crossed, I think that's bad news. So I think they look at the situation with, well, Maxime is in a better position to tell with great concern here.
Before I turn it over to you, I just wanted to make two brief comments that occur to me. My old friend, the late Larry Eagleberger, said at the end of the Cold War there would be times when we would rue the loss of the predictability of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And Russia may feel a little bit of this with respect to the Middle East. It is also fascinating that to some extent the absence of the U.S., which is now quite striking, has not changed world thinking yet about who advances the new ideas and builds coalitions and make things happen to deal with world that is coming apart at the seams in ways that important assessments in these capitals treat as very serious. In a way, it's kind of still watching the old movie when in fact everything has gone over to television and expecting the old movie somehow to play and produce an answer. And I just put those out there on the line. Now, you all are brighter and a lot more capable than the rest of us who've been struggling with these questions. So I'm going to ask for you to raise your hands or do whatever else needs to be done. And so, Barbara, you have obviously the right of first refusal here. Please go ahead and bore in, will you, a little bit from your journalistic experience.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers. Really interesting comments. Maxim, I wanted to take advantage of your unique perspective and get a little more detail about Syria. In what ways do Russian and Iranian interests coincide, and in what ways do they differ? And how do you sort of see this going forward? Astana, Geneva, I mean, do we really have a viable strategy to end the war?
Maxime?
You want to go now?
Пожалуйста. Okay. You asked Maxime, didn't you? Yes.
Right. Well, it's just trying to make up my mind on how to make it real brief. Well, certainly, as I mentioned, I'm gonna talk about this common vision. It's pretty much there. There's certain, I think, these conversations, serious conversations, have started between Russians and Iranians on this kind of future composition of Syria, second half of last year, and this year will definitely continue. There is this kind of conventional wisdom that Russia would be more flexible on Assad than Iran. Well, actually, I think to both parties, the very figure of Assad, they both recognize the controversial matters behind it and stuff. But then the thing is, so far, and both I think have searched for other alternatives, including within the Alawite community in Syria, and realized that so far there hasn't been anyone who's able to control, the army and would have this political leverage. So it is very difficult to see whether how far it can continue and how manageable President Assad himself would be in the short term, right? As he gains more, reclaims more ground from the opposition and from terrorists, he doesn't really feel inclined to be, compromising all that much. Another thing is this potential kind of rivalry, even though it's really hard to tell how much of that is there, is about this who gets to control some of the resources. I think there've been some reports on the phosphates. Is that how you say it? On this Moscow and Tehran competing for phosphates in Syria and things like this. Ultimately, I would say that the objectives that Moscow sets are more, they can be achieved not necessarily through control over ground, over land, like political things and how you do. Well, certainly, I think there is this concern for ensuring that the military facilities stay, but I think that the recent deal is for 49 years. They should be around. And how much of leverage you have over Damascus and who is the president there. And so for Moscow, it is not so much about land control, resource control, where for Iran it is more important. And in that, I think, when you ask about Astana, there might be more tensions or potential areas of disagreement between Iran and Turkey than so much between Russia and Turkey. Because, Syria, speaking in the Russian terms, it's not Russia's near abroad, right? Whereas for Iran and Turkey, it is.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question on the left over here. The gentleman who had his hand raised several times, about 3 rows back. No, the next gentleman over. Thank you, and we'll catch the rest of you.
Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. Russia has consistently supported anti-colonialist majority rule. And the support for the Alawi in Syria is a distinct departure from that. Alawi comprising only 15% of Syria's population. There's potentially a one-bullet change between Alawi dominance of the Syrian government and Sunni dominance of the Syrian government. And yet we see Russia in no way hedging its bets here. I'm wondering if it's possible, Dr. Rumer, to shame Russia into recognizing that it's supporting a very small minority rule. And alternatively, maybe to say, if you give up on al-Assad, maybe you get to keep your bases.
Gene, and then others, feel free to comment too. Gene?
Good luck. I think shaming and naming doesn't work in these circumstances. Russians have been in business with the ruling family for 50 years or so, and it's the relationship really that's been one of the pivotal relationships for them in the Middle East. What leverage do you have to deny them access to the bases they have now?
Sunni government closes down the bases.
Where's that government?
Demographics.
Well, demographics, right. I mean, the demographics have been there for many, many years, for as long as the Syrian state has existed. And, that hasn't really mattered that much. So I'm very skeptical of this proposition. And as others have said, look, we've been appealing to the Russians to give up their relationship with the Assad family, and I think consistently and repeatedly they've told us, show me the alternative. Yeah. What better deal do you have? I think they genuinely are not sort of committed in a sense. They're not married to the Assad family, but What's the better option?
Having spent a certain amount of time in Syria, let me just say that it isn't one bullet away. The Alawites are pretty thick on the ground. And the Alawin have been very, very influential in, putting it this way, stiffening Bashar when at any moment of weakness arrived. And so I'm not sure, in fact, that's the case. The Sunni have not been united. They can, but that's not necessarily the major factor in that regard. So the one bullet away piece is, put it this way, a vast triumph of hope over reality.
Okay.
Maxine, please.
Can I just quickly add to that, these are interesting things, and I think they're more like an academic side where you're trying to box your perception into certain things. You're supported colonialism, where you're not doing this now. I think part of the reason why Russian foreign policy in the Middle East is relatively successful, at least at this point, is because there's been a departure from a lot of previous traditions, including the Soviet time, where you side with someone who shares your ideological kind of commitments. And that's part of the reason Russia is working with every parties there. Secondly, supporting Assad, again, as my colleague mentioned, is not like because his father and himself are tied to Soviets or to the Russians. Actually, if you listen to a lot of talks that Putin gave on this issue, he's kind of trolling the Europeans and saying, well, before the war, he wasn't really our friend. He was seen in European capitals a lot more frequently than he was in Moscow.
Yeah.
And another point is that he is to be the one, at least he positions to be taking care of other groups and ethnic groups in Syria beyond the Sunnis, and there are plenty of them. And speaking of the demographics, I'm not prepared to say how many like Sunnis and Alawites and Christians are there now, because there's so much left, so many of them left. And I don't think we can have any credible data now at this point with everything that's happening there right now.
Can I just,
Ted?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Ted, go ahead, please.
Yeah, go ahead and then jump in. Go ahead, Ted.
Okay, I just wanted to add that it's Russian-Syrian relationship, historical in nature, really have to go back 19th century, look at the relationship between Tsarist Russia and the Levant at the time, and look at the outflow of Circassians who now live amongst the elites and function as guards for the elites in these countries. This is a very important part of why Russia is able to do what it can do, because it can rely on those historical connections, but it also can play the ethnic card, which it does brilliantly.
Gene.
Just very briefly, I think the path of naming and shaming and applying more sanctions upon sanctions really is not going to work in these circumstances. I don't quite understand the logic behind declaring that, we're not going to provide any, I suppose it's a form of sanctions, we're not going to provide any assistance to the Assad-controlled areas, which I understand is the current position of the administration based on Secretary Tillerson's speech yesterday. Again, we're declaring that we're going to keep a sizable military presence in Syria to counter the malign Iranian influence, which to me I think flies in the face of common sense. I think now is the time for diplomatic engagement, not for naming and shaming.
Okay, I'm going to take a question on the right. Lady here, please.
Thank you. This is Faye Mokhtar from Atlantic Council. The question is for Mr. Karasik. You mentioned that the Gulf nations are very much interested in seeing Iran completely missile-less, but you have to remember that during the Iran-Iraq war, where with the collaboration of Saudis and the Israelis and the United States helping Saddam, Iran was begging around the area for any kind of a missile help, and nobody helped Iran. So, if I'm sitting in Iran as an Iranian official, I don't think I want to see my nation to be completely defenseless when you're surrounded with the Pakistanis and also Israelis, which they have missiles that are, you could put warheads on them too. And Iranians' missiles are short-term missiles, and they don't have that capacity. So this idea of Iran being completely missile-less seems to be a very unreasonable.
Wishful thinking, right?
Yeah.
But don't miss Russian Scuds in Iraq. They were the missiles that were most used. Please go
If I
ahead.
could piggyback on that,
Please. Yeah.
in 2020, Russia can sell arms to Iran again, right, under the JCPOA. So, Ted, would the Gulf states rather see Iran without missiles and with new fighter bombers? If that was the choice?
You guys are
Okay.
really on a really great question, and I love it. But I think, we're dealing with extremes here. What the Gulf states want to see is they're being so strong, obviously, because they want Iran's missile program and proliferation and capability to be restrained. That's the bottom line. So the idea that, they're not going to get rid of all of course not. But it's about trying to stop the proliferation. And again, as I said before, they see the proliferation as part of a larger problem of missile proliferation throughout the region, and they want to have a say in it. So when the Khaliji are saying certain things, they're really meaning something else, and it's really important to understand those distinctions.
Question over here. Gentleman with a nice brown hat.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. I'd like to address this question to Maxim. You used the term strategic single to refer to Russia. I think you also had Iran. Now, Putin himself in many fora has made the statement that there are only very few truly sovereign nations in the world, of which he considers Russia to be one. His argument being most everybody else, or a good example, the U.S., is so tied up in networks of alliances that as a nation it can't actually freely operate without considering all its alliance responsibilities and ties. Do you think this freedom, as he sees it, that Russia has is one of the keys that has enabled them to have this flexibility, which in the earlier session everybody said was so mysterious. He seems to be getting along with everybody, deals with everybody. Do you think he has a point there, and that's one of the reasons he can operate in a way that we find so surprising?
Well, yeah, certainly I'll be short on this. Yes, and I think I mentioned that before. And that's why I kind of challenged this little proposition that the strategic alliance is not necessarily a desired framework. And I would put the emphasis there not on the word strategic, because I think it should be strategic, and that's where both Russia and Iran are aiming for, but on the very word alliance, because it seems to be more tie in your hands, and you have to. That's where I was saying. You have to be careful. Partnership is excellent, but if you're an ally, you have to, sideline with a lot of their agenda, which may be detrimental to Russia's own relationship with Saudis and with Israelis and with the Americans in this respect.
Question on this side? No more here. Gentleman right here on the aisle.
Thank you. Herb Rose. It's been suggested here that Russia will be managing the reconstruction in Syria. I'm wondering who you consider to be the major funders of that reconstruction, and considering the position of this administration in the United States, whether or not any money will flow to reconstruction in Syria.
Good. Anybody want to volunteer? Ted?
I'll start off by saying, as I mentioned before, there are a couple of these plans running around in terms of how to do this and how to get in country. And you see that there's a conference coming up in Kuwait about reconstruction. The Russians are very much involved in this in Kuwait. You see other discussions about in Lebanon about opening up ports and being able to get the equipment and so on into Syria itself for reconstruction. The point here is, as you asked, where's the money going to come from? And originally the idea was that the Gulf states would come up with some of the reconstruction money to be met with the Europeans and so on. These ideas are still being cooked around, if you will. What is important to watch is, as I said before, is about the sovereign wealth fund activity, because the sovereign wealth fund activity in the Gulf and with Russia will look towards an area of opening for these states to do business together, and also for the monies to be provided to start this process. Now, having said that, it's important to recognize, of course, the Gulf states themselves are going through a transformation, and they're transforming into a new reality that's post-oil and so on. We all know and study this. What's important to recognize here is that the monies from this transformation, and for example, from other activities involving IPOs and other financial transactions, will provide some of the monies for this reconstruction project. However, other fights that are ongoing throughout the region, and particularly what may happen in Northeast Asia, will stop reconstruction funding. And I think it's real important to think about transformation in the Gulf and reconstruction of Syria with this scenario for DPRK hanging out there, because if that goes off, monies that were being invested in the Gulf and Syria will not exist for many years.
Question back here, the gentleman with his hand up. I'm trying to get the microphone boys to lose a little weight by shifting back and forth.
Bill has a question.
Nate Mason with CNO Resources. Just to follow up on that, what's the incentive for the Gulf nations to pay for Syrian reconstruction? I mean, it seems like they would like to see Assad going, and they would like to see Iran not having a land bridge. It doesn't strike me that Russia can offer either of those things. Instead, you might think of Iran and Russia and Syria as the dog that caught the car, right? Neither of them have a ton of cash. Both of them then stuck with reconstructing this or having their policy look like a failure with an ongoing insurgency almost certainly. Why would the Gulfies even consider bailing them out of this?
Because the Gulfies use their foreign policy in a very soft way, okay? And one of the soft methods that they use in their diplomacy is, as I've been talking about, is an investment. And the investment that they do across the region in commercial and residential projects gives them a hand and a say in the country that they are doing business in. Where are some of these areas that you can go look at and explore yourself? I would take a look at, for example, Macedonia. I would take a look at other countries such as Belarus. There's a lot of investment going into Belarus because of food security. That's a strategy of the Gulf, right? But they also have this other strategy about investment in real estate and other projects. And from the Gulf point of view, this is not only about an insurance policy for future, but it's about what I just mentioned a moment ago. It's about political influence at the end of the day.
Bill Lewis?
Can I just
Maxime, you want to comment first?
Yeah, just briefly talk about this. You know, I think to seriously talk about this matter, one needs to have a lot of trustworthy data, like where, because otherwise it's a lot. There's a lot of speculation. One thing I would add to that is it's one issue who gets to pay for the reconstruction, and a very important other thing is who gets to control the money. And you know, when Russians and Iranians are having conversation about this issue, and I've heard a lot of people in Tehran talk about China, and this is interesting politically. I don't know how well it's going to sit with the whatever United States is considering, or Russia for that matter. And another thing is how do you get to control this is and I think there'll be more genuine interest of participating in this if Russia does see as you mentioned, there's not a lot of cash, a lot of resources to invest in it, but there are opportunities. If there's some international money, Russians will definitely compete for being able to control it. And I think as Secretary Mattis actually mentioned early in January, the United States is seriously looking into this idea of administering foreign aid. Right? He didn't necessarily say the United States is going to pay for it, but they're thinking about foreign aid that the United States can control. So I think that area may be potential, another, if you're thinking of what next might be on the agenda for you.
Bill Lewis? Raise your hand and they'll find you with the microphone.
And can I just say, in the meantime,
yes,
if you are the Gulfies, so to speak, a question for those who know more about it, now that you've lost the war in Syria, wouldn't you want to make your way back into Syria in some way through some application of soft power?
Exactly.
I mean, I think heavily that depends upon what is the future weight of Syria and who would you rather keep out of Syria as points. And I'm not sure that this seems to me to be a little bit more of what I would call philosophical hope than practical reality. But anyway, Bill, go ahead.
I just got a phone call that I want to talk to you about. No. Okay. Two language clarifications. One is the issue of Gulfies and Gulf states.
Yeah.
Don't we have to stop using that expression?
Absolutely.
I apologize.
I mean, the fact is, there are three Gulfies now. There's Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the Emirates. Qatar is not playing in that world, particularly on relations with Iran. Their relations were never very good with Iran, but they're getting much better for a lot of practical reasons.
They're being
and
driven
in fact,
to it.
the Qatar, they've opened up their conferences now to Iranians going there. And Oman and Kuwait have always been sort of ambivalent in any case. So when you talk about Gulfies, you're talking about three countries.
Absolutely.
And you're talking about the Saudis, is what you're talking about.
Yes, sir.
And it seems to me that you have to realize that with regard to Iran, there's no longer a unified view toward Iran. The second is the issue of strategic, whether it's alliance or partnership or relationship. I wonder if you wouldn't agree that Iran has a greater interest and purpose in their use of the term strategic partnership than Russia. I mean, it's true that Iran uses this term a lot, and they tell us a lot privately and publicly that this relationship is very important for them. And there are a lot of reasons for that. At least one of them is the fact that you have such good relationship with the Arab states. It's not just about Iran and Russia. It's the fact that they've been trying to find ways to reduce the tensions with the Saudis. You have a particular relationship with the Saudis through the oil connection. I mean, you've successfully raised the price of oil by $20 over the last couple of months. And I think they want you more than you need them. And so they will continue to press the strategic partnership. I just like
you want to make any comments on that?
I just have a very quick comment. You're absolutely right about the nomenclature, about GCC. For a lot of people, for some scholars, GCC still exists, and it does still exist. It still functions as an office and so on. But the concept of the Gulf states, if you will, or the GCC, I absolutely agree with you. It's very important. I've changed it to Arabian Peninsula. It's a lot easier to describe, and it captures the entire geography. But the other part is, too, is that I had 7 minutes of opening comment. If I had gone through each Gulf state, that would take an hour. So this is the issue right now, is we are dealing with these different countries. They're grouped in different ways. Some are leading others. Kuwait, Oman are the outliers of this relationship. They're also the ones who are trying to resolve the dispute, the fight between these states, while at the same time thinking about their big neighbor to the east. And this is important. That's part of the strategic pie too.
Maxime?
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's a very fair observation. One thing, and definitely I believe when Russia and Iran say strategic, they do not necessarily mean the same thing. However, I think when Russia is talking about strategic partnership with Iran, it means that this relationship should go beyond Syria. and also projects on what I mentioned, infrastructure, economy, things like this. And there is also a very important component that I just didn't mention because it's not really maybe relevant here, but it kind of builds into this idea of a future world order that Russia sees, where Iran, as some other big regional powers, are very important, and having good relations with them is very important. So in that sense, it is strategic, and it's because it's also long term. You think you'd want to invest more into it.
Gene, any comment?
Well, I think I'm with Maxime in that generally I tend not to put too much weight into, what is the definition of a strategic partnership versus strategic alliance. I think countries, depending on, or governments rather, depending on specific context, use those somewhat loosely. I'm reminded of the relationships that we established with some of our European countries outside of NATO in the 1990s in some of the former Soviet states. We call them strategic relationship or strategic importance, when really there were two kinds of relationships there. There was NATO and non-NATO, and that was it. So, so I'm somewhat skeptical of it.
I'll take one more question. Yes, please. Sumita.
If I may, could I ask two quick ones? First, for the entire panel, if someone could just, if you could elaborate on Russia and China and whether bilaterally or multilaterally, if that is true, have they discussed the JCPOA or any related matters to the Middle East?
That's a whole other panel.
Right. Yeah, I know. I mean, India is now a part of the SCO, but as Ted mentioned, it's more to figure out what's going on there more than anything else. The second question that's for you, Ted, is if you could, given your sovereign wealth fund study, I've not looked at it yet, but how do you see particularly the Emirates or Saudi Arabia or Qatar viewing, let's say, Russia, China, India? Because you did mention the Russia case. There's at least a two-way. The money goes in, there's something coming back.
Right.
I look at India, there's a 75 billion infrastructure fund set up, very few projects just starting out, but what's the UAE getting in return? So I'm just curious how you see the regional players viewing these Asian countries.
Ted, why don't you lead on that, and then we'll comment on Russia, China.
Very good. On the SWIFT activity, I think it's really important to understand that sovereign wealth funds are unique to each state. They're all different. There's the Santiago process, or agreement rather, that sovereign wealth funds are supposed to adhere to certain rules and regulations governing their activity. Well, many countries that are not in the Western Hemisphere don't adhere to the Santiago principles. And therefore, we need to be watching the activity of these sovereign wealth funds between these states in order to better understand exactly what that political relationship is like. And it's important also because of some of the more nefarious activity that may occur on the side of sovereign wealth fund transactions. And we've seen a couple of these cases come out. I'm not going to say them here, you can Google them. But these types of, it's exposure and risk. And that is the big issue here for these countries. And the question is also, of course, how will US regulators and so on look at this type of activity in the future? I hope that answers your question.
I'm going to take the floor because I do want to end on time. I have a personal reason. I have a business meeting to go to. But on Russia, China, it seems to me that that could take us a long time. But my summary of that, just a personal one, would be good relationships on a case-by-case basis with various issues over time, but the sense that they would enter into a strategic alliance of enduring quality in which one accedes to the leadership of the other is something that stretches beyond even the imagination at the present time. And I think one needs to look at it in that context. And if my colleagues have disputes with me, they'll come to you privately after the meeting, because I want to do one thing that Bill asked me to try to do, which to try to do a little bit of summing up. Some of it I've done along the way, and I think Dr. Gopal did some of that himself very, very well for us. But I would say the following things strike me. And this takes me back to my opening remarks. This is a tremendously complex and seriously convoluted and difficult problem. The second point is here, both Russia and Iran, the Gulf states in Iran, and Asia giants in Iran, all have some common themes and have some differing perspectives. Common themes is they're all interested in oil, but some in oil price and some in oil availability. And those two are not necessarily totally compatible as ways to proceed. The region, in my view, is deeply struck by what I think is the absence of the United States, as I said earlier, in a leadership role. At the same time, the world generally usually wants to think regularly about what does the United States think about the problem as we try to make up our own minds as to where to go. I think the United States is worse than absent. The United States is now in a position, with the unpredictability of the president and the discordant nature of government operations in the United States, in a damaging mode rather than a damage limiting or productive solution mode, both of which I think used to characterize people's general judgments about the United States. That the United States didn't do damage, but it didn't do damage by indirection. It did damage by major fault in assessment and failure to analysis. And I would say Vietnam and Iraq are primary examples of how the United States did damage with what one can only call some better intentions than they should have had on those particular issues. So we are not completely absolved by the notion that we have a crazy leadership at the present time, in a sense that the past was so much better. But I think that that is a particular problem. We need to be concerned about proliferation in the region as a serious and I think potentially damaging effort. We need to be deeply concerned as well about the potential for conflict in the region, which I think, because of the absence of conflict for such a long period of time, we treat much too lightly as a serious and important and indeed dominant factor, in my view, in strategic thinking. I think that there is, as we have seen in our discussion, a serious effort on the part of the various players to take advantage of what I would call unrolling possibilities, as opposed to long-term strategic thinking about outcomes. And this used to be something that the United States dominated, as I said a moment ago, and its absence has left the field open as a vacuum yet to be filled by anybody. China has shown more signs, but China's traditional foreign policy shyness in taking on more and more serious burdens as a world player has held it back a little bit, as well as China's, I think, well-founded policy of not wanting to intrude in local issues unless it was a serious, major Chinese vital interest at stake, if I could put it that way. And I think that part's important. Russia is back, and I think that the points that have been made by both of our, I think, esteemed and I think well-qualified commentators on Russia. Russia is out there filling vacuums. I wish I knew better what Russian strategic interests were, other than taking opportunities to take opportunities short-term to benefit Russia. And perhaps, as Maxime has pointed out, an anti-US coalition that might be built around that set of factors. We have not discussed Europe. Europe is still quite silent and I think in disarray on this set of issues in the Middle East. My own view is, as you look to the future, we will have to, in our own country, decide in the next 4 months how to proceed. I think there are 3 tracks that are important here. Bob Einhorn did a very good piece on what might be reasonably near or medium-term efforts to deal with what I would call the problems of Iran, both within the JCPOA and in the outside context of ballistic missiles. And Barbara, you know that a colleague and I did a piece last March, which is even longer term, about an international agreement that might in some ways or another succeed or amplify the JCPOA. The second track is extremely important. The president has given a 4-month deadline, but the wished for seems to be ambiguous. And it is time for us and the Europeans, particularly with the European lead, maybe with Asia, to sit down and talk about either the principles they would like to see guide the future of a relationship with Iran in the nuclear area, or the outlines of an agreement that might be put forward as an answer to the president, because it is ridiculous to believe you could negotiate a new JCPOA in 4 months, an impossible task. But putting something forward that brings people together, once again can use what I think is at the moment, the somnolent possibilities of the states that we have talked about today moving. The third piece is more complicated, but it would be, in my view, a brilliant stroke if the Congress would amend INARA, our domestic legislation, get rid of the finding and get rid of the waivers in the other pieces of legislation in an act that was specifically designed to do that, and put in their place a combination finding of the IAEA and the U.S. intelligence community about Iran's continued compliance against a standard that is reflective of the last 2 years of compliance. That is full operation of a joint commission to work out any misunderstandings on the one hand, and secondly, a clear view as to what would consist of a violation, which means obviously breaking any of the strictures of limitation on the JCPOA. In my view, that could be linked to these findings as triggers, and then to the reimposition of sanctions, since they would be waived by the legislation pending the trigger putting them back in place, and it would be linked with a snapback at the UN, which is already available under the JCPOA. So that would keep the JCPOA in place. It would move ahead in the direction of improvement, which the president says he wants to do, and it would take off the back of the president the onerous burden that they put lightly onto the back of President Obama when clearly the Congress wanted to make things more difficult for him. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you. Please give our panel your warm applause.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's nice to see you.
I want to add my thanks. I think we have lunch outside for those who can hang around.